that.
I would love that. You know, I've had in my field a few conferences at in Lake Como, Bellagio. You know, Bellagio.
Of course.
And boy, that's the closest to paradise I've ever been.
Yeah, no, these locations, spring, summer, maybe summer can be too hot in certain months, but spring and fall, you can have amazing landscape, sunshine, and then sit in a conference room the whole time thinking, why am I not outside?
Exactly.
Why am I here?
Wait a second. Villa Mondragone, where is it physically? In Rome,
in Frascati, right? Yes, it's in Frascati, which is a town in the outskirts of Rome. And it was so weird because a couple of weeks ago, I was watching a Korean TV series on Netflix. And lo and behold, they filmed it. One of the episodes was almost entirely filmed at Villa Mondragone. I recognized it immediately because I've been there twice.
Amazing. Have you been watching a lot of Netflix and that kind of thing?
Of course.
Have you watched by any chance Babylon Berlin?
Not yet. Do you recommend it?
I surely do. Babylon Berlin and also Charité, which is kind of the same series. They're fantastic. You know, those are
great.
Both my husband and I were great fans of foreign film, right? That's how we got into the Italian Istituto. But in recent years, we haven't been going to movies at all. You know, we've been so busy, but over COVID, we went back to Netflix and all the movies and all that. Very good ones. Italian movies, of course, we love.
You know, a lot of struggle makes for great screenplays. So when you have a lot of, we're going through a lot as a country and, you know, as a community, then you have plenty of material for great movies and great TV series and the like.
You know, I think Italy is amazing in terms of, you hear about the struggle and, you know, all the political, the political instability and all that, but things work one way or another, you know? I mean, I'll give you a very micro point of reference, right? So a few days ago, I was at a Zoom, and you know, NBR, the National Bureau of Asian Research, the whole system, they had WebEx, was extremely unwieldy and all that. This one was a simple click, and here I am. I mean, I'm glad that it worked out because it's 1 a.m. here and I'm completely phased out. I don't know what I'm doing.
I can only imagine. You know, one thing that you might want to keep in mind is that this conference is perfect for scholars in your field because it is very interdisciplinary in nature, in the sense that you will find policymakers, you will find practitioners.
Yes.
And then you will have some sessions that just look like your standard economics conference. People are presenting papers with models. And so so it's really a meeting point and it's very well attended by representatives of international organizations, such as ourselves, but also OECD, World Bank. So it is always a pleasure for me. And also, I think they're very smart in scheduling it. Normally, it's at either the end of June or early July. So it's the perfect time, because if you are an academic, you're done with your teaching.
Right.
If you are an Italian scholar, or you are just returning to Italy, so you can just make a stop in Rome and participate. Right. So it's extremely...
I can see everything you just said. I can see in the program, right? It's very diverse and all that. And actually, the comments that I was listening to by Paolo Guerrieri, I guess, they were surprisingly very much down sort of my alley. But you know what, to be frank, I think this is becoming more and more the norm everywhere. There's a lot of interdisciplinary efforts here on anything from not just COVID, but the geopolitical, the environmental. There's so much interdisciplinary research moving forward that I've never seen, I think. I always liked interdisciplinarity, but I've never seen this push in terms of funding and all that. So that's fantastic. That's really good.
Yes, absolutely. And I think economics really needed this big kick in the butt, because feels to me like for a few decades we have been sort of twisted into a pretzel, talking to each other, and we have really kind of stepped out of the policy space,
Yes.
egregiously in certain areas. So I really very much welcome this new development, and I hope it's here to stay.
But this disciplinary silos, it's not just economics, and it's the formalization of theory and all that. It's not just economics. It happened across certainly my field. So I think there's a little bit more understanding that you have to go back to kind of some sort of real world issue that you're trying to solve, not just some I think we're moving in that direction. I don't know.
Yeah, couldn't be more welcome. Hey, we have another presenter. Hi, Simona.
Hello.
Hi.
We are waiting for our session chair to join us.
Here.
I think. You are already here. Fantastic. Okay, please take over. I think I've talked enough.
I'm just arrived.
Well, it's wonderful. Welcome.
Okay, let's wait 2 minutes in order
Good morning, everybody.
to
Good
start
morning.
in time. This is a session with 4 papers, so we have not much time. We have to close at 11 past 30. So I suggest 20 minutes per paper, 15 for presentation, and another 5 minutes for Q&A, if you agree. Okay?
Yes, Professor, one question. Do you want to do the Q&A all at the end, or you want us to have a Q&A at the end of each presentation?
Well, as you, there are 4 papers, so it may be better to have a Q&A after each paper. Otherwise, it's too much time passed after the presentation on the first 2 papers. So, okay, it's another minute and we start.
Can I try sharing my screen? I think I'm going first, right?
Yes.
Can I try sharing my screen just to make sure it works?
Yes, try.
Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint presentation there? No?
Not yet. Yes. It's not easy to read, at least.
Yeah, unfortunately. How about this one? No?
Yeah, we can see it. Just one piece of advice, Ethel, would be to go full screen when you start presenting.
Exactly. Just wait.
You mean to do this?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Sometimes it takes over my other screen, but yeah, that's fine. So you can see this, right? You can see this?
Yes. Try navigating 2 or 3 slides back and forth to get a sense of whether there is a delay. No, it looks like almost, it's, yeah.
Okay.
Looks good.
Okay. I think we can start. This session is on global value chain and trade. It's a topic there is a big debate on this especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think it will be a very interesting session. So let's start with the first paper. It's presented by Ethel Soligen of the University of California, Irvine. And the title of the paper is GVC Interdependence and Geopolitics, What is at Risk? So you have 15 minutes for your presentation, then 5 minutes for Q&A. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Quinteri and Elisabetta, for the invitation. Now, it's 1 a.m. in Los Angeles, where I live, and no amount of espresso is helping, but I'll do my best. So my remarks, actually the title of my presentation adapted to this panel is now GVC Responses to Geopolitical and COVID-19 Shocks in Asia Pacific. So my remarks build on this book that literally was just published by Cambridge University Press. And the COVID part borrows from a paper that I'm authoring with Meng Bo and Xuan Kai for ADB. But briefly, let me move to some sources. Basically, the outline is geopolitical and COVID-19 shocks, sources and effects, how uncertainty has affected.
Another unique feature of our panel is the geographic.
How firms have responded and some conclusions. So I referred here to geopolitical risks that are systemic, interstate, meta risks with the potential for unleashing vicious circles and downward spirals. And they are typically triggered by trade and technology wars, export controls, boycotts, cyber attacks, and other forms of unilateral, coercive economic statecraft. The deeper sources of these risks are in the disparate political incentives underlying two contrasting ideal typical political economy strategies. Outward-oriented strategies that induce this virtuous circle that I have on the screen, following liberal economic theory, where economic interdependence has a pacifying effect, or at least heightens the threshold for militarized conflict. And by contrast, the inward-oriented ideal type maximizes political benefits domestically by rejecting, restricting, or disrupting GVC interdependence as anathema to self-reliance. Nationalism, protectionism, and populism aim at substituting foreign sourcing and offshore production with domestic supplies, at retracting GVCs from countries perceived as unreliable suppliers of intermediate goods and services, and more generally, at reducing demand for foreign inputs, all trends that have intensified worldwide recently. Hence, these inward-oriented strategies typically denounce the risks from GVCs rather than the risks to GVCs. Perceived asymmetries in gains make this interdependence a source of uncertainty, vulnerability, and friction. So zero-sum assumptions, prisoner's dilemma, relative gains dominate. The security externalities convert economic gains into strategic advantages. That's kind of the way of thinking. Why do we observe the rise of inward-looking strategies today? I don't have time to discuss that, but these two slides provide some sources, some like this one in the realm of political economy, all the sources that many of you are familiar with, economic anxiety, labor market risk, etc. But there are also other factors that we label sociotropic factors in the realm of affective and cognitive that are largely unrelated, to trade shocks. Again, I don't have time to describe those. They're an interesting question that occupy my field in particular. But here are some of the estimates for the effects of geopolitical risk. See, for instance, the study by Gentile et al. On the cost of an additional 25% tariffs for GDPs, employment, and trade in both the US and China. There are other studies mentioned here. I have to move fast on this one. So here are some of the mechanisms through which geopolitical risks affect GVC. They magnify generalized uncertainty, they reduce trust in the integrity of GVCs, they induce vertical contagion or retaliatory processes, they exacerbate horizontal contagion onto third parties, etc. Mechanisms, uncertainty is a key mechanism. And this study by Ahir et al., it's a World Uncertainty Index, shows the dramatic rise in uncertainty in 2018-2019 with the US-China trade war. You can see a peak here. And the next slide shows how COVID-19 compounded uncertainty, raising the index to its highest level since 1990 in the third quarter of 2020. You can see again the coronavirus peak, which is obviously higher than the preceding US-China trade tensions. Now, very briefly, the sources of COVID-19. Of course, this is there is a major geopolitical tension over those sources of COVID-19, but some of the factors that help spread the pandemic risk do coincide with dense GVC activity, international travel, high socioeconomic globalization, urbanization, geographic agglomeration, population density, etc. Of course, poverty, income, and health inequalities have also helped spread pandemics. Now, COVID-19 affected GVCs through declining production due to reduced labor force, spillovers upstream and downstream, especially among economies with high GVC trade, and other contagion and reverse supply chain waves. Lockdowns and border closings, of course, reduced GVC operations, efficiency, productivity. There was rising demand for ICT, online services due to the acceleration of remote working, rising demand for medical equipment and pharmaceuticals, contracting demand for air travel, tourism, restaurants, and of course, synergies between supply and demand shocks. The impact of COVID-19 has been more global, larger scale, and long-lasting than any recent pandemic. It affected GVC dense centers through all phases of production, but effects, of course, vary according to economic size, coping mechanisms, degree of openness, participation and position in GVCs, etc. Most affected were US service exports and initially China's manufacturing, of course, but only initially. Bonario et al. Estimate that COVID-19 contributed about 30% to average real GDP decline, and that GVCs accounted for about 1/4 of that decline. And of course, uncertainty, as I said before, at historical highs may explain that 60% of output contraction. Now, here are some aggregate effects of geopolitical and COVID shocks that I literally just put together today. The top left shows how the US and European total GVC-related imports from China in $1 billion grew significantly since 2016. But by 2018, trade war, there was a clear inflection point downwards. This is pre-COVID, along with the trade war, and a decline that COVID-19 exacerbated by 2020, as you can see again in the top left. The top right shows considerable decline in complex GVC-related imports from China by European partners since 2018, that's in orange. But interestingly, for the US in blue, a decline in complex GVC imports in 2018-19 with the trade war was reversed in 2020 under COVID-19. The bottom left shows a pronounced decline in simple GVC-related US imports from China in 2019-2020. And the bottom right shows a rather stable China share of total complex GVC-related imports by the US since 2016. A slight decline since 2018 with the trade war, but a sharp increase in 2020 under COVID-19. So this bottom right shows basically that the China share in total complex GVC related imports by the US increased in 2020. Next, how have firms responded to these shocks? Let me just highlight, I have a long list in there, but I'm just gonna highlight the top one, that 66% of the firms polled deemed decoupling impossible in 2019 prior to COVID, but only 44% thought that decoupling was impossible in 2020. And I can come back to this slide if there are any questions later. What strategies have firms embraced? Building resilience through automation, digitalization, diversification, just in case, capacity buffers, regionalization, nearshoring, shorter GVCs, etc. COVID-19 was the tipping point for digitalization. But most firms retained an in China for China strategy. About 80% had no plans to relocate out of China in 2018, and that rose to 85% in late 2020. So fewer companies thought about relocating out of China in 2020. However, 96% of US-based companies and 100% of Europe-based companies listed China as one of their top 3 sourcing countries in 2019. And that declined to 77% and 80% respectively by March 2021. So there is a decline there. We're not back into the status quo ante. What do we know about resilience? Generic factors affecting relative vulnerability or resilience across risks include, of course, the nature and characteristics of the shock, including size and sector, region specificity, GVC structure, whether it's symmetric versus HAB, the presence or absence of choke points, etc. And also industry features, upstream versus downstream, availability of substitutions, short, long term, and the degree of transactional stickiness. Complex, lengthier GVCs with concentrated production or distribution were most vulnerable, but despite calls for self-sufficiency in food, pharmaceuticals, and medical equipment, GVCs have been fairly effective in adjusting to shocks and shortages. But shortages of all sorts, not just chips, disrupted transportation, port congestions, etc., remain, of course. Now, I'm going to move to this slide because according to Professor Antras, many of you may be familiar with, the main challenge to globalization, and actually the previous talk I heard at this conference made a similar point. The main challenge to globalization and GVCs remain geopolitical shocks, which target highly vulnerable components, sectors, industries with high input specificity and limited geographic mobility. It targets GVC hubs with high potential for diffusing throughout the economy, knowledge-intensive GVCs in specialized and localized ecosystems with unique suppliers, you'll know who I'm talking about, and difficult to substitute expert pools. And of course, dual use, civilian, military, and frontier technologies are frequent targets. Now, one warning from my field is that our research shows that spillovers from economic to military statecraft can be hard to anticipate and prevent. So we're not here simply talking about the economic effects of geopolitical risk. Let me just quickly move to some conclusions. Risks to GVCs are on the rise, especially environmental ones, in addition to geopolitical and pandemics. And environmental ones are also less controllable in the short term. Environmental, pandemic, and geopolitical risks all have anthropogenic sources. So there is a lot we can do to minimize them. GVCs amplify the impact of shocks, which is part of the problem, but they can also mitigate those risks. So they are arguably part of the solution as well. Firms' investments in resilience is real. 87% of these 1,300 plus firms are actually doing that, top firms. And reshoring is hardly the standard GVC response thus far. There does not seem to be a GVC bifurcation yet that is observable yet. Indeed, Jonathan Austri, the deputy director of the IMF's Asia and Pacific Department, found also little evidence for this GVC bifurcation into parallel structures aligned with US or China spheres of influence so far. But there does seem to be a trend to China's partial potential decline as factory of the world, the way we know it, but hardly its demise. Diversification, which is ongoing, has taken mostly the form of China plus one or China plus many strategy, where China's domestic market remains a powerful source of attraction, but adding additional countries softens somewhat extreme dependence on China. So all of this suggests a revised, but far from an obsolescing GVC infrastructure, which could possibly emerge even more resilient. However, caution, coercive statecraft is contagious and counterproductive. Xi Jinping's dual circulation policies and some preliminary US responses continue to fuel some uncertainty. So there is a non-trivial likelihood that geopolitics, technological competition, and the legacy of COVID-19 might unleash even more sizable disruptions in the global geography of production. Now, the book I'm drawing from has much more in it on GVCs and technology, on artificial intelligence, US domestic politics, China's domestic politics, labor, Japan, South Korean relations, the smartphone industry, all of this related to GVCs. The book is on geopolitics and GVCs. I'll stop there, and later maybe I can share a slide on policy recommendations. I think I'm below time, I hope. Okay,
thank you very much. The time you have consumed also the time for Q&A.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry.
It doesn't matter. However, it was very interesting. However, there's, I think, time for one question. For anybody wants to? Any question? I have one question. I refer to the recent agreement signed in East Asia, the RCEP, and this will create presumably new opportunities for GVC in this very large area. And the question is, do you think that this agreement is going to improve the geopolitical relation between China from one side and countries like Japan, Korea, and Australia, which were not so friendly in the past?
Are you talking about RCEP?
Yeah.
Yeah. Many eyes are posed on RCEP as sort of a redeeming feature. And of course, I think China took the opportunity. It was a low-hanging fruit, and is one of the prospects that actually can also energize GVCs going forward.
Okay.
And I think, by the way, that intra-East Asian relations have not been affected as severely yet. There are some severe frictions like Japan and South Korea, and now emerging Japan and China and so on. But overall, they've been able to keep the two separate and continue with their economic activity. So on that note, there may be some optimism.
Okay, thank you very much. If you want, you can go back to sleep.
Thank you. I'll stay a little bit.
In the night or something?
Yeah, it's 1 a.m. in the morning. 1:30 a.m. in the morning. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so somebody else can go.
Yes, please. So let's move to the second paper that is going to be presented by Elisabetta Gentile. And the title of the paper is Income Convergence by Developing Asia, Accounting for Jobs and Earnings in Global Value Chains.
Thank you so much, Professor Quintieri, for the introduction, and thank you, Ethel, for the perfect first presentation for this session. You have already introduced a lot of topics that will be part of our discussion.
Thank you.
So the title of this talk is Participation in Global Value Chains. Is it driving income convergence in developing Asia? We are investigating this question by adopting a task-based accounting approach. What is the motivation? Again, as Ethel has already mentioned, participation into global value chains has always been heralded as a powerful driver of growth, productivity, and job creation. And one of the important mechanisms is the fact that countries can take advantage of knowledge flows and technology transfer within GVCs to transition from assembly to higher value-added exports. And when we talk about GVCs, we talk about Asia almost all the time, because we have to remember that Asia is only the second most integrated regions after the European Union. Asia's GVC participation in 2019 was 67.4, and very soon we will be able to calculate for 2020. Despite that, GDP per capita in developing Asian economies is still about 1/3 of the average of the OECD average. So the question becomes, with such a high level of integration, how is it that income per capita convergence is incomplete? So with this paper, we really wanted to, first of all, understand what are the drivers of income convergence in developing Asia. And then we wanted to look for evidence of upgrading, both within activities. And when we talk about upgrading within activities, we're talking about productivity boosts from product or process upgrading. And upgrading across activities, again, we are talking about upgrading from lower value-added activities to higher value-added activities, the process that Gary Jareffi many, many years ago called functional upgrading. So for this particular paper, we will break down activities along global value chains into two categories, and we will see how already this simple breakdown provides a lot of information. The first category is what we will call production activities. So production activities are those performed by workers whose occupations are involved in the physical transformation process. Knowledge-intensive activities, on the other hand, are carried out by workers with occupations involved in pre- and post-fabrication. Just to give you a visual description of what I'm talking about, as we plot the sequence of activities from pre-production, production, and post-production to have a finished output on the horizontal axis, and we put a value added on the vertical axis, we have the famous smiley curve, which shows that, again, these production activities all the way at the bottom are associated with low value added that the firm and, as a consequence, the economy can capture. Whereas the pre-production activities like research and development and design and post-production activities like marketing and after-sale services are associated with much higher value added that the firm and therefore the economy can capture. So in this particular paper, we refer to knowledge-intensive activities as both the pre-production and post-production activities that capture higher value added. So what is the contribution of this paper? Again, we use this GVC income accounting framework. And again, we want to look at scale and productivity in driving income per capita convergence in developing Asian economies to OECD levels. So when we say scale, we refer to the share of workers from developing Asian countries involved in GVCs of manufactured products. When we talk about productivity, instead, we are referring to the productivity level of carrying out tasks in the global value chain. And we believe that we add value by studying developing Asian economies for which hardly any such analysis is ever performed. Okay, I don't want to dwell too much in the literature, but I just want to briefly brush the three big branches, the three big approaches that can be taken to study this kind of question. The first one is the approach of the longitudinal study. So we have two examples here. The study by Brancati et al. Is actually based on very detailed firm level panel data of industrial Italian firms. So this allows to find out all kinds of very detailed information about the firms, their innovative activities, their production activities, their exports, and so on and so forth. The second example that I'm citing here is Belder-Bos et al. This is an OECD study that is actually based, again, on a panel of greenfield investment deals, and that actually, so this way we can actually trace the linkages, so the activities going from one country to another. So this is a great approach, but it has a disadvantage, because if you look at detailed firm level data, you will not be able to trace activities across the border. So you will know a lot about what a firm does, but you will not be able to see these linkages backwards and forward. An approach like the one from the OECD study instead has a lot of detailed information, but only about one type of linkage, which is greenfield investment. Then you have input-output study, like the one by Pal and Timmer, and also our study. This study fits in this category. This provides a bird's eye view of the global value chain, where you can see the entire economy, you can see all the cross-country linkages, but of course, because again of this bird's eye view, you lose quite a bit of the detail that firm level surveys can provide. And finally, we have comparative case analysis. So I provide here two examples. The first one is a paper that studies two firms. One is a leader in the world leader in the manufacturing of wind turbines, and the other one is a new entrant into the business from developing Asia, from India. And so the study uses both quantitative and qualitative information to document the entire process of catching up from the new entrant to the level of the top firm in the sector. The second paper instead by my friend Professor Eugene Xing and Xiaopeng Guan performs what we call a tear-down analysis. So it takes 3 different smartphones and literally tears them down to see the value added of which component accruing to which firm and therefore to which economy. So this comparative case analysis say a lot about a specific sector or a specific product, but of course the results must be taken with a grain of salt when we attempt to generalize them to other products in other sectors. Very briefly, what are the lessons that we have learned from the literature so far? There is a lot of diversity in methodological approaches, but we know that there is a positive association between GVC participation in labor productivity in developing economies. We also know that catching up with industry leaders in terms of product portfolio is one thing, catching up in terms of innovation capabilities is another. And in fact, emerging economy multinational enterprises still have a way to go when it comes to building innovation capabilities. Alternative upgrading patterns are also emerging. In the past, we have been talking about functional upgrading as a linear process where a firm goes from assembly to manufacturing of core components to brand all the way to higher value added activities. But now these alternative upgrading patterns are emerging whereby firms can rely on exported components or imported intermediate inputs to build their own brand and manufacture their own products without having to build the capacity in manufacturing of core components. So now we need to discuss data real quick. Let me check how I'm doing. Time-wise, I'm doing okay, I think. So the first important data for this project is the ADB multi-regional input-output tables that provide comprehensive summaries of all transactions in the global economy between industries and final users of goods and services. And again, the important thing is that we can trace value added across sectors, countries, and years. The EBA royalties are currently in US dollars based on exchange rate conversions of data in national currencies. So we also perform an additional adjustment of GVC income by activity for each country such that it is at US dollar purchaser power parities in constant 2011 prices. And then, of course, we use the price levels of output side real GDP relative to the USA from the Penn World Tables. The second important piece of data for this project is the occupations database, which is introduced by my co-author, Heitzen de Vries, in a different paper. It provides information on employment and labor income share by occupation, country, sector, year. So the original data set includes already 40 economies, but we actually had to process worker and labor information from labor force surveys, national representative, or population censuses for additional 11 developing Asian economies. That was the most time-consuming part of this process. So our final set of countries is the following. We have 15 developing Asian economies, and we have 29 OECD economies that are forming the data for our project. Again, I want to emphasize that building the occupations database is perhaps the most time-consuming and the biggest contribution of this paper, because it starts by procuring national representative labor force surveys or population censuses. Then they must be harmonized to ISCO and ISEC. Then you have to check for internal, intertemporal, and international consistency. Then you have to break it down by production activities and knowledge-intensive activities, as we mentioned earlier. And then this is pretty much how you do the mapping. So you take the type of activities and then you map them to occupations. Again, this is based on the international standard classification of occupations. And so now we are ready to talk about the framework. So as I was saying, the framework is very simple and intuitive. It's really the data work that is the main, the core part of this paper. So first of all, when we talk about income in this paper, we are not talking about gross domestic product. We are talking about income from carrying out activities for final manufactured products. This means that GDC income is only a part of a country's GDP. So another important element to emphasize is that activities in GDCs of manufactured products can be performed by firms classified in the manufacturing sector, but also services firm. So for example, an Asian firm might be involved in business processing or accounting for a final manufactured product for a firm in Germany. So the output has to be manufacturing, but the intermediate inputs can come from manufacturing, from services, and even from agriculture. And here is the first level disaggregation of GDC income per capita. See, on the left-hand side here, you can see the income ratio. So GDC income per head of population for country C. On the right-hand side, you can see the very simple disaggregation into the scale ratio, so the fraction of GDC workers per capita, and the productivity ratio, which is the GDC income per GDC worker per country. So as you can see, once you divide these three ratios by the OECD average, you have relative measure of the developing Asia with respect to the OECD. So here is what GDC income per capita for the 15 developing Asian economies looks like. The blue histograms are 2000, the Bordeaux histograms are 2018. And one thing transpires very clearly for this, in 2000, with the exception of Taipei, Taiwan, GDC income per capita in all of these developing economies, but Taiwan, was below 25% the OECD average. But already we can see that in 2018, all of these economies, except for Nepal, were able to increase their GDC income per capita. So this 18-year period really does show evidence of GDC income convergence. And so much so that, and we can see very clearly, especially countries like the People's Republic of China, Thailand, and Indonesia, that have been basically trying to develop an industrial policy and trying to build a manufacturing sector.
Elisabetta?
Yes.
3 minutes left.
Wonderful. Thank you for letting me know. Here is the time trend. And as you can see, even excluding the PRC, you can still see this convergence process from 12% to 34% roughly. So there has been an impressive convergence in GDC income in developing Asia. So when we look at the scale ratio and the productivity ratio, you can see very clearly that the most important driver of convergence has been really scale. That is the number of workers that have been able to participate in global value chains. But when it comes to productivity, as you can see, with the exception of Taipei, of Taiwan and Fiji, we are even below 1/3 of the OECD average. So productivity, yes, there is a catch up going on, but from very low levels and a very slow process. So when we go to the second level disaggregation, all we do on the left-hand side, we split GDC income for knowledge-intensive activities and GDC income for production activities. And on the right-hand side, we want to split scale and productivity, again, for knowledge-intensive activities and for production activities. So when we do that, we see again that the driver of the income convergence process has been the involvement of Asian workers in production activities. Although even for knowledge-intensive activities, there has been a convergence, again, from a low starting point. And then when we look at the number of workers participating in production and knowledge-intensive activities, as opposed to the productivity in production and knowledge activities, we can see again that it's mostly the number of workers joining GVC-related activities, especially in production, that have been driving income convergence. So to conclude, we have used the GVC perspective to investigate the drivers of income convergence in developing Asia. We found a rapid expansion in the scale of production activities between 2000 and 2018, but a much slower expansion in the scale of knowledge activities, and convergence in productivity levels to levels observed to the OECD countries, but from very low initial levels. I would like to finish this by just talking about the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this first part has been already very well shown by Ethel: enormous disruption and permanent changes, exacerbation of pre-pandemic trends like the fourth industrial revolution and resurgent protectionism, which have reinforced regionalization, localization, and diversification trends. Now, what developing Asian economies want to know is, will this dreaded reshoring of production activities back to the OECD happen? Will the forced innovation from the pandemic boost productivity in the region? And will inequality rise in the region as some economies are unable to cope with the new challenges? So this is really the next step for this research project, to try to give answers to these questions. Thank you so much, and my apologies for going a bit over time.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that to this question, we could have a few answers by the next paper by Aridut Shingal. I don't know if anybody wants to do any question. We are not much time, but however,
I have just a brief.
Simona, yes, please.
I know it's not probably the point of the paper, but well, I don't know if you investigated the within countries inequalities and if it plays a role in the convergence of Asian countries to OECD countries.
Thank you, Simona. Actually, we have done this for a different paper. There is always a possibility to disentangle pressures that are coming from cross-country linkages and pressures that are coming from within-country linkages. So I'll definitely discuss this with my co-author. As usual, you know, the paper is getting already a bit long, so perhaps this could be the scope for a different project. But I think what you're saying is very relevant, Simona. So thank you for your feedback.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, let's move to that paper, which will be presented by Anirudh Shingal from the European University Institute. The title is "How did GVC trade respond to previous health shocks? Implication for COVID-19." Please.
Thank you so much, Professor Quintieri. And I'd also like to thank Professor Agneto for this invitation and for this opportunity to present my work. So this is joint work with Prachi Agarwal, who's based in Delhi. And we look at the response of GVC trade to previous health shocks, in particular looking at SARS and MERS. You know, it's a tough act following two very good, excellent presentations, but I'll try to do my best. It's also a bit long, so I'm going to rush a bit. So in terms of a bit of a background, we've already had some, but COVID-19 has had significant implications for trade and investment due to disruption of GVCs. There is some literature already which is documenting the channels through which these disruptions have occurred. There's been a demand shock caused by lockdowns and stalled economic activity across countries. There's been a supply shock which emanates from temporary and permanent disruptions in supply networks. And of course, there is the GVC contagion effect, which has also been now well documented in the literature. what these disruptions have actually done is they've reignited the discussion on geographical and supply diversification, nearshoring, and indeed repatriation of value chains. But having said that, it may be too soon and premature to examine the extent, nature, and impact of these disruptions using currently available data. So what we do instead is to look at how previous epidemics like SARS and MERS impacted GVC trade. And we do this in a bid to both understand how value chains may have responded to those crises and also to draw any implications for the current pandemic. We choose SARS and MERS for reasons that are common to the current pandemic. Both outbreaks originated at an epicenter but spread around quickly. The diseases are characterized by flu-like symptoms, and we expect manufacturing value chains to be adversely affected by both episodes. So what is the contribution of this paper? We aim to contribute to extant literature by studying GVC responses to SARS and MERS as observed in actual trade data, and in doing so, we explore the following hypotheses. What is the extent to which the disease outbreaks were associated with a rise in domestic production at the expense of total imports? So that's the reshoring hypothesis. Was there a tendency to reduce the share of imports from disease epicenters in favor of other partners during the epidemics? So that's the geographical diversification hypothesis. Were the disease outbreaks associated with a rise in the number of suppliers for each GVC-based product that was imported or exported? That's the GVC widening hypothesis. Was there a tendency to move value chains closer home, i.e. to import more from suppliers in the geographical neighborhood? And that's the nearshoring hypothesis. And finally, did the GVC disruptions coincide with the time period of the virus outbreaks, or did that dissipate over time? And that's the GVC resilience hypothesis. How do we do this? So essentially, we use a difference in difference analysis embedded in a structural gravity framework to examine the effect of supply and demand shocks induced by these two outbreaks on bilateral trade in GVC-based intermediate and final products, as well as value-added trade. We measure the shocks using binary dumbing variables that take the value 1 for the SARS worst affected countries in 2003, and we look at 6 countries in particular that was the worst affected. And for the MERS worst affected countries, which was Saudi Arabia over 2013-17, South Korea in 2015, and the UAE in 2014. So our identification strategy essentially exploits differences in the time period of the severe incidence of each disease outbreak, and also in the samples covering exporting and importing countries that were more adversely affected than others, to essentially look at the supply shock and the demand shock emanating from these outbreaks. In sensitivity analysis, we also combine the shocks together because we realize that in a general equilibrium framework, there's not too much of a separation between a supply and a demand shock. But fortunately for us, the results are found to be qualitatively similar. So what are the results? So our baseline estimates suggest that the SARS-induced supply shock was associated with a 4.9 to 6.6% reduction in the exports of GVC-based intermediate and final products over 2001-2008. The effects on the demand side were much stronger. They were much larger at close to 30% for intermediate products and 22% for final products. And this seemed to suggest that the shock emanating on the demand side was probably more permanent. Having said that, we did not find similar effects, similar adverse effects at the intensive margin from the MERS outbreak. At the same time, there was evidence for geographical diversification of value chains. So for instance, the MERS-induced supply shock was accompanied by a rise in the number of trading partners for GVC-based intermediate products, and also by a decline in the partner concentration for GVC-based final products. We also found some suggestive evidence in the stylized facts for both reshoring and nearshoring. What is also important is that unlike some preliminary research that is coming out, and the next presenter is going to discuss some of this, we found that the value chains may not have been resilient to the SARS outbreak. So we found that the adverse effects at both the extensive and the intensive margin were intensified and accentuated significantly over time. We also find that the findings were observed at both the intensive and the extensive margins. And when we did a little more analysis on what could drive the SARS effects, we found that the SARS results were driven by non-OECD countries that were also more integrated and downstream in GVCs, and by products that were more capital and technology intensive. Products that were less capital and technology intensive. So In a sense, GVC participation was found to be an important mechanism for propagating SARS-induced shocks, which is also in line with recent literature. Now, the paper is related to several strands of existing literature. So there's, of course, a lot of work that looks at macroeconomic consequences of natural disasters, including health crisis, and the paper fits well there. There is also now growing literature on the robustness and resilience of supply chains to global shocks. And this paper provides empirical analysis and stylized facts to contribute to that literature. Of course, it fits well with the literature that looks at the role of GVCs in the propagation of the COVID-19 induced shock. And there's a lot of recent work, some of which was highlighted also by the first speaker. And of course, the paper also is consistent with literature that looks at the determinants and the effects of the 2008-9 global financial crisis, and also the larger effects of natural disasters, especially the 2011 earthquake in Japan. So, you know, the literature, the current paper is well situated in recent literature. Talking quickly about the data sources, so we use bilateral trade data from BACI, which is disaggregated at the 6-digit level over 2018 for over 200 countries. The products used in disaggregated analysis are classified as intermediate and final products in GVCs according to the World Bank WITS classification. In particular, we look at 6 sectors: apparel, automobiles, electronics, footwear, pharma, and textiles. For value-added trade analysis, we use the UNCTAD EORA GVC database. And the analysis and the stylized facts that look at the reshoring use data from the UNIDO's INSTAT database, which is at the ISEC level classification. And for this analysis, therefore, the HS6 products have been aggregated to the ISEC 4-digit level. Now, in the next few charts, I want to provide some suggestive evidence for the hypothesis that we explore in this paper. So the first is reshoring. The charts on the top panel look at the imports, and in the bottom panel look at the domestic output. We have GVC-based intermediate products on the left side and final products on the right side. The 2 bands, the thin band corresponds to SARS during 2003, and the wider band corresponds to MERS during 2014-15 in particular, which was the peak of the MERS crisis. And the different lines correspond to the sectors. So we have apparel and footwear, which is in green. We have automobiles, which is in yellow. We have auto and electronics, which is in blue. And then we have electronics alone, which is in red. So we see that during the SARS outbreak, there seemed to be little suggestive evidence for reshoring. The imports, global imports seem to be going up. And at the same time, domestic production also seems to be going up. So there is really no suggestive evidence for reshoring. However, there seems to be suggestive evidence for reshoring in the wake of the MERS outbreak. And especially we see that for the red worm. We see that imports have been going down. Imports of intermediate products went down. And at the same time, output seemed to be going up. So there is some preliminary evidence for reshoring to have occurred in the wake of the MERS outbreak. What about geographical diversification? So here we look at imports of intermediate, GVC-based intermediate products from 3 SARS-worst affected countries. We have China on the left, we have Hong Kong in the middle, and we have Singapore on the right. The 3 charts on the top panel look at the intensive margin. So what happened to the share in value terms? The middle panel looks at the number of partners from which you were, so the number of countries, the number of importers of these products from these 3 countries. And the bottom panel looks at the mean number of products, the number of products imported. So again, if you look at China, extreme left, there is no evidence for any adverse effect from SARS. The imports from China seem to be resilient, in fact, seem to be going up over time despite the SARS epidemic across sectors. In contrast, if you look at Hong Kong in the middle, there is clear evidence for a lack in imports or a fall in imports at the intensive margin. And then if you look at Singapore again, there is evidence for a downfall in imports at the intensive margin, and for some products also at the extensive margin. So there may have been a tendency to diversify geographically, but not from China. What about MERS? So if you look at MERS, again, it's the same thing. We have Saudi Arabia on the extreme left. We have UAE in the middle. We have South Korea on the extreme right. Once again, intensive margin is in the charts on the top panel. In the middle, we have the number of partners. The bottom panel is the number of products that were imported. And again, there is suggestive evidence across sectors. And especially in the case of Saudi Arabia, you see both at the intensive margin and the extensive margin, and both in terms of number of partners and number of products, that MERS may have been associated with an adverse effect. We see similar effects in UAE, but with a time lag. In South Korea, there are more effects at the intensive margin and in terms of the number of products that were imported from South Korea. So again, there is suggestive evidence that there may have been some geographical diversification in the wake of MERS. But so this is just to, this is obviously suggestive evidence. For more sophisticated analysis, we embed this in a gravity framework. So we look at exports from country I to country J at time T. I is for intermediates, F is for final products, and these are both GVC based. And then we have the SARS dummy. So we have the SARS exporting country dummy and the SARS importing country dummy. And then we have a dummy, which is the PTA variable, which takes the value 1 if the two countries or the two trading partners were part of a preferential trade agreement. We estimate this both at the intensive margin, so we look at the value of exports, and we also estimate these equations at the extensive margin, where we look at the number of products that were exported. Both equations are estimated with three-way fixed effects, which not only accounts for multilateral resistance in estimation, but also takes care of endogeneity-related concerns. So we employ exporter time-varying fixed effects, importer time-varying fixed effects, as well as dyadic fixed effects. These two estimating equations were at the intensive and extensive margin. To look at geographical diversification more concretely, we estimate the Hirschman-Herfindahl index, both for intermediate and final products, and the number of partners. Again, but we do this only for the supply side shock. So we depart from the gravity framework in this case. The estimation strategy, the intensive and extensive margin analysis is estimated using OLS. And for geographical diversification also, that we estimate using OLS. In some sort of diagnostic analysis using the Mora-Reggio common pre-dynamics text, we find that the parallel trends assumption may have been met in all cases, which suggests that the difference in difference estimates identify the average treatment effect of the treatment in each case. So I'm going to sort of rush through the results. I'm not presenting concrete tables because that was getting a little messy. I'm just going to highlight the 2% reduction in exports of GVC in final products, 2001-2000. Effective declines associated with the demand shock were 1.21%. For MERS, this was at the margin. Extensive margin find effect on the side, but on one side, the shock was associated with a 1.5 to 2.3 reduction in number of.
We cannot hear you anymore.
I think he got dropped.
Hello? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we cannot see you, but we can, at least we can hear you.
Okay. And can you see me still?
What we cannot see is the presentation.
Sorry, can you see the presentation?
No. So se Federica, se ci stai ascoltando,
Sì, professore.
possiamo fare qualcosa.
Se non ho problemi di linea, io consiglierei di andare avanti eventualmente. Passiamo al prossimo intervento finché...
Però stava finendo.
Ah, ecco, eccolo.
Ok, you are back again.
Yeah, I think I seem to be getting disconnected. I seem to be getting disconnected. Let me try and share my screen again. Can you see my?
Not yet, not yet.
I'm going to try and shut off my. Let me just see.
Can you go?
Can you see my screen now?
Yes, yes, okay. Okay, you can go on. Ok. Di nuovo, ci siamo perso di nuovo. Simona, tu sei collegata?
Sì, io ci sono.
Aspettiamo ancora 2 minuti perché stava per concludere, quindi interromperlo sul finire non mi pare carino.
Professore, magari gli possiamo consigliare di tenere la webcam chiusa perché la sua connessione non ce la fa a sostenere sia la presentation che la sua webcam. Quindi gli consigliamo di usare solo microfono e slide share e poi quando ha finito può accendere la webcam.
Mi pare un'ottima soluzione. Questa è la soluzione necessaria, perché non ce la fa a sostenere le due cose. Sì.
Anirudh, can you hear us? Anirudh. Non ci sente neanche.
Mi scrivo un'email.
Sì, esatto.
Yes.
Hello.
Okay. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I hear you. Just getting dropped out.
It's better if you switch off the webcam and just show the presentation.
Yeah, just give me 1 second.
Okay, go on, go on.
Yeah, I'm just going down. I'm just trying to share my screen. Just give me 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you see this?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So I'm going to, I have a couple of slides to finish now. So I wanted to focus on the non-resilience to the SARS pandemic. What was interesting is that the magnitudes of the adverse effects were found to have intensified significantly over time. So they increased over 2005 to 2008 from 2.7% to 20, from 4.8% goods exports. And this underlines the medium to the long-term impact outbreak. This is also consistent with some where and Tang have looked at Chinese firm level import and find similar medium-term impact of SARS. And this also suggests that the demand may have more permanent in nature, and that has more significant role in propagating the shock from such outbreaks. I think this is has been played for the in terms of drivers, as so we explored a couple of hypotheses. High-income countries are more likely to do better inter alia by providing contractual security to shock. In a world of complex interconnected supply chains, the heterogeneous impact of the outbreak will be conditional upon the degree of linkage between countries. And then, of course, trade costs have higher incidence on downstream stages. These trade costs are likely to get compounded by shocks. And we found evidence for all that. Export countries were also affected by the supply macro shock. And then, of course, we found that more capital and like very quickly, just onto my concluding slides now. It is very tempting to compare SARS and COVID, given that both of them originated in China. I think we must be cognizant of the fact that at that point of time, China accounted for 4% of global output, and now that number has quadrupled. Even otherwise, the overall impact of COVID-19 is likely to be much worse. The scale of the current pandemic is much larger, right? So there were less than 10,000 lives affected by SARS, and there are now obviously more than 180 million confirmed cases of COVID-19. There was a lot more, the stringency of the measures imposed during COVID were a lot more severe, and that led to an immediate supply and a subsequent demand shock, which is still being repeated in countries across the world. And then some other work that have looked at the impact on services in particular. And this actually is a huge chunk here, because services trade, even in gross terms, accounts for about 25% of total trade. In value-added terms, it's about 50%. And services trade is going to be more severely affected because 3 of the 4 ways in which services are transacted internationally require physical proximity between the buyers and sellers. And that is the first casualty of social distancing and travel imposed in the wake of COVID-19. And of course, if you think of China in particular, China now specializes in more technology and skill-intensive products. And therefore, it might have already experienced faster recovery.
Okay.
So this is my last slide. What could be the implications of the findings from SARS for COVID? So I think one implication is for countries to diversify geographically in terms of suppliers. The first speaker already alluded to this in her presentation, but there's also a lot of anecdotal evidence which suggests that may be happening. And, there are a few examples here on the slides. So, there is going to be definitely a China plus one strategy, if not a China plus many strategy. And several countries in Southeast Asia are going to be likely benefactors of this.
Okay.
So in what we would, I'd just like to conclude by saying that while value chains may have exhibited selective resilience to previous health shocks despite disruptions, there may be somewhat more permanent changes this time around, increased diversification away from China. And it's going to be interesting to examine these changes as well as the effects of the fourth industrial revolution, GVCs, in future research. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think we have no more time for question, unless there's time for one question. Anybody want to? I have one question. SARS and MERS have been a rather geographically limited epidemic episodes, while SARS is a widespread phenomena. Don't you think that this will increase the probability that first will be more resilient than in the past, instead of doing reshoring or nearshoring?
So I think MERS was more geographically limited in coverage, but SARS was still more widespread. So, amongst the worst affected countries, we have Southeast Asia, but we also had Canada. So, and there were lots of other countries that were affected also. So I think, if at all any implications can be had, I think it's SARS that is more relevant. For the current pandemic, of course, though the scale is much different. In terms of resilience, I think there's something that needs to, I honestly think that countries are definitely going to start diversifying value chains. I don't think there's going to be too much movement in terms of repatriation or even bringing them closer home, but they will definitely try to not put all their eggs in one basket. That's for sure.
Okay, thank you very much. The move to the last paper of the session is the resilience of global value chains during the COVID-19 pandemic, the case of Italy, that is going to be presented by Simona Giglioli, former University of Rome Tor Vergata, but now also Bank of Italy. Simona.
Okay, good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so thank you for the invitation. I'm presenting this work I wrote in collaboration with Giorgio Giovannetti from European University Institute and the University of Florence, and Enrico Marvasi and Arianna Vivoli from the University of Florence. So let me briefly start with an introduction. As we know, there has been a trade collapse in 2019. So after international trade has seen its importance increasing from the 80s to the great financial crisis, then this importance has just stopped or at least slowed. So we entered in a phase that has been called deglobalization or slowbalization by many economists, among which and Truss. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the world was in such a phase from a decade. And so the first reaction of government has been to limit the movement of people, both national and international movements. And they saw the global value chain as a shock, as a device for shock transmission. And so the first reaction was to also implement export bans, also because there was the risk of medical supply shortages. So the policy debate moved around terms as deglobalization or regionalization and reshoring. This figure resembles the one of the World Development Report of the World Bank. And as I was saying, we can see that from the great financial crisis, the importance of the international trade, measured as the import over GDP globally, has just stopped increasing. And it is now below the trend that was forecasted based on data from the 80s to the great financial crisis. But actually, if we look at the COVID-19 crisis, we see that it is quite different from previous crises. First of all, the shock was mainly exogenous, at least initially, before the government implemented the policy measures. So it was totally unexpected. There has been an extreme disruption of global value chains and a rapid interaction between supply side shocks and demand side shocks. Whether these are permanent or temporary, it is still an open question. We can make some hypotheses, but it is still, the pandemic is still ongoing, so it is something to be investigated later on. Also, compared to the great financial crisis, it is different, the sectors that have been most hit. So while during the great financial crisis, the manufacturing sector was the most.
Mona.
Yes.
What we see is just the first slide.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I tried to share it again. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Now it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, I'm sorry. So yes. Okay. So
now it's okay.
Okay. The figure I was talking about was this one. Okay. So I was saying, compared to the great financial crisis, the service sector was more hit than the manufacturing sector. And overall, we can say that the great financial crisis, the COVID-19 crisis compared to the great financial crisis has been stronger in terms of GDP, but also the government response has been faster and unprecedented. So if we ask whether global value chains transmit shock, the answer is probably yes. But what we want to investigate with our paper is whether this can be not necessarily bad. So we have seen that during both the global financial crisis and COVID-19 crisis, the interconnectedness among countries has increased the shock propagation. But since we have seen that these two crises are profoundly different, we ask ourselves whether in this case global value chains can have a different role, for example, in allowing for a greater diversification of sourcing and destination markets, thus contributing also to the resilience of countries and firms during the COVID-19 pandemic. So a brief preview of our results. What we find is that the global value chain participation initially exposed countries more to shock, but then allowed for a faster recovery. At the firm level, we see that the more internationalized firms, or the firms that operate in more internationalized sectors, suffer less from the crisis. This can be because these firms are the ones who more rapidly reacted to the crisis, for example, implementing online activities or shifting to remote working. Let me just briefly explain what data we use for our analysis. So there are two big sessions. The first one is a macroeconomic session in which we perform a cross-country level, and the second one is a microeconomic section in which we perform firm level analysis. For the cross-country level, we measure the COVID-19 shock as the updates in the GDP growth forecast made by the IMF in the World Economic Outlook. In particular, we look at the forecast made in October 2019, and then we look at the update made in April 2020, and we account it as being the first wave shock. And then the update in October 2020, and we look at it as a measure for the second wave shock. Then for an illustrative purpose, we also try to explain our results using different data and different approach. So we build a VAR and we construct the impulse response functions using daily data for the daily industrial carbon emissions that we use as a proxy for the industrial production, and daily new COVID-19 shocks. To measure the global value chain participation, we use the input-output tables from the Asian Development Bank, which are the most updated ones. And we build the global value chain indicators based on Koopman et al. And Borin and Mancini. At the firm level, instead, we use the survey of the World Bank. And in particular, we use the October 2019 survey and then two follow-up made in June 2020 and December 2020 with information about the impact of COVID-19 on firms. So again, we look at the round one as a measure for the first wave COVID shock and round two as a measure for the second wave COVID shock. What we find at the cross-country level, so we want to measure the correlation between the global value chain participation and the COVID-19 shock. So if we look at the entire period, so the first wave and second wave together, we see that there is a very slight and positive correlation between the two variables. It is not significantly different from zero, but what emerges is that at least the global value chain participation has not harmed countries in during the COVID-19 pandemic. What's interesting is what we find when we divide the two waves. So we look at the two waves separately. And we see that the correlation is negative in the first wave, meaning that more integrated countries and more exposed countries have been more severely hit by the COVID-19. But this correlation changes sign in the second wave, meaning that during the second wave, more integrated countries recover more rapidly from the shock. And so the global value chain participation acted as a shelter in this case. We can see that Italy, for example, had a much stronger COVID-19 shock in the first wave than in the second one. So what we wanted to measure is the rapidity of recovery from the first wave to the second wave. And we measured it as the difference between the second wave COVID shock and the first wave COVID shock. So if we look at the correlation between this measure and the global value chain participation, to see how global value chain participation can imply a different rapidity of recovery of countries, we see a positive, a quite strong and positive correlation. What does it mean? That more integrated countries, so countries with a higher level of global value chain participation, manage to recover faster. Of course, there are many elements that could contribute to this recovery. We are not implying that there's a causality between the global value chain participation and the rebound, because also many governments then implemented measures to limit the shock. So it also, of course, matters in the analysis. But we thought that the evidence was suggesting. As I said, for more mainly illustrative purpose, we developed a VAR approach, and we built impulse response functions using daily data. We actually have similar results, meaning that we can see that countries more involved in global value chains in the first wave experienced a greater shock in terms of industrial production, but then recover faster in our simulation. And the shock, both in the first wave and in the second wave, was more permanent for countries that have a lower value of global value chain participation. Regarding the firm level, what we wanted to do is to replicate the analysis we performed at the macro level, but at the micro level. This was not very easy because data availability is very different at the macro and the micro level. But in this case, we measured the COVID shock as the change in sales. With respect to 2019. So the change in sales reported in June 2020 and December 2020 with respect to the same month in 2019. And to measure the integration, a measure of integration of firms, we used two methods. First, we computed the global value chain participation as we did at the macro level, but I used the World Bank data to measure the export as a percentage of total sales. So if we perform again the analysis looking at the correlation between the COVID shock measures by the change in sale and the degree of openness, we find something similar to what we found at the macro level, meaning a very slight correlation in round one, but a quite stronger and positive correlation in round two. So data at the micro level confirm what we found at the macro level. There's one difference, that is that in round one, whereas at the macro level we had a negative correlation, we here have a very weak but positive correlation. This can be because the round two is measured differently in the macro and micro level. So across country, we looked at the forecast updates in April, whereas here round two is is in round one is in June, so it can already integrate some measures that were taken by government. So that can be the reason why the correlation is positive. Again, if we look at the shares of firms that reported the sales reduction, we can see that all firms reported more losses in round one than in round two, but the domestic firms, a larger share of domestic firms reported larger share compared to international ones. Also looking at different modalities of being international. So also in this case, both looking at large shares, so large losses, so losses more than 30% of sales, and losses more than 50% of sales, which is the median. We see that actually international countries perform better than domestic ones. Firms, the international firms perform better than domestic ones. One reason for this can be that the international firms reacted more quickly. So if we look at the share of firms that started or increased online activities, in which round, we see that the international firms actually were more quickly in starting or increasing online activity in the first round with respect to domestic ones. And this can be one of the reasons. Another reason can be that another measure to see the rapidity of reaction is the shift to remote working. And also in this case, we perform an econometric analysis looking at the probability of remote working and for different kind of firms. And we see that the domestic firms are the only one for which the marginal effects are negative. So international firms are more likely to shift to remote working.
3 minutes.
So, yes, I'm just concluding. So what we find is that the global value chain participation seems to initially expose more countries to shocks, but it also allows for a faster recovery. And overall, we can say that the global value chain participation has enhanced the resilience and acted as a shelter for countries. And when we look at it at the micro level, we see that the results are consistent. So more internationalized firms or firms that operate in more internationalized sectors suffer less from the crisis. This can be because internationalized firms reacted quickly, and this emerges clearly from our evidence, and adapted strategies such as shifting to remote working and implementing online activities. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Simona. Any question? Okay, it's 11 past 30, so we are perfectly on time. I think it has been very good session, and in 15 minutes time, another 2 sessions will start. So thank you very much to everybody. See you next time.
Well,
Thank you. Thank you.
Beniamina, let me give my thanking to all the participants for this very interesting session, and thanks to the Forza Azzurri. Excuse me. And to thank Elisabetta Gentile, that has been an engine that created the condition for this session. Thanks you.
Thank you, all of you. It was a great session, and I'm glad that you recorded it because we will be able to watch it again and really benefit from it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I hope so.
Yeah, thank you so much again. Yeah, the quality of the presentations was really good. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Dottor Paganetto?
Sì?
Ecco, sono Susanna, salve. Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Che non ce lo siamo ancora detti stamattina. Allora, professore, adesso Salvatore le manderà il comunicato stampa che il MAE ci vuole mandare
Sì.
per se gli può dare cortesemente risposta e poi loro, diciamo, ci apriranno sullo streaming. Non riesco a parlare né con Barbieri e Rutelli, non so come contattarlo. Lo streaming è la trasmissione su un canale YouTube.
Sì, ma io ho parlato con Rutelli, ti ho mandato.
Sì, però ha detto che domani manderà una persona, ma noi lo streaming lo dobbiamo definire oggi perché ci vuole un link.
Sì, ho capito, aspetteranno agli esteri di sapere chi manda, insomma non sarà la fine del mondo se lo sanno domani.
No, non è una questione di mandare perché non ci vuole la ripresa diretta, cioè Rutelli va con la telecamera e fa la ripresa diretta?
Non lo so che cosa vuol fare, non ho capito perché.
Vabbè.
No? Però io ho l'impressione che non è un problema irresolubile perché
No,
eravamo rimasti d'accordo che loro partecipavano, loro faranno un servizio sicuramente, forse mandando un giornalista perché se prende appunti.
Va bene, questo il giornalista semplicemente si deve accreditare, non è un problema. Il problema è un canale, noi non abbiamo un nostro canale dove mandare la diretta.
Va bene.
Sì, sì.
Ti lascio un momento perché mi occupo di altro. Tanto mi ha fatto piacere salutarti molto.
Anche a me, a presto, grazie.
No, tanto nessuno si scambia. Buongiorno agli altri partecipanti, chiedo al relatore che è entrato da poco, quindi non al dottor Giovanni che ha già messo il suo nome, ma all'altro relatore, se mi dice chi è, posso aggiungere il suo nome. Giovanni Di Bartolomeo già ce l'ha e gli do il benvenuto, non so se vuole fare una prova audio. Let me ask to...
Sente l'audio?
Sì, si sente.
Comunque dovrebbe presentare il paper, in realtà l'imperio che si dovrebbe connettere a breve.
Ok, non è quello che lei vede a fianco, giusto?
No, non è l'imperio.
Perfetto. Thank you very much.
Grazie.
Good morning to all speakers. I can see Giovanni Di Bartolomeo and also Paolo D'Imperio and Carlo Favero. May I ask to the other speaker connected to present himself? So,
io sono Davide Assalve.
Sorry, I cannot hear you.
My name is Davide Assalve. Can you hear me now?
Okay, thank you very much. Davide Assalve. Thanks. So we will rename your connection. And I think that the audio, Dr. D'Imperio, would you like to make an audio test, or?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good morning to Dr. Tardieri.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno. Salve.
Mi conferma che è in inglese la...
Yes, the session is in English.
Ok.
Cosa sta facendo questa cosa?
Anna, sono io.
I believe you named me Carlo Favero. At least that's what I see in my screen. My name is Davide Assalve.
Can I ask for confirmation of... So Davide Assalve is presenting the paper with Ottavio Ricci?
I'm presenting with Elena Giacchini.
Or the two of you will be presenting?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I please ask staff yes, thanks.
Obviously, Carlo Favero, ciao, good morning.
Ciao, ciao Riccardo.
And so what's the order of play? First, Carlo.
Yeah, if I look at the program, it looks like that, right?
Okay. Yes. let me just bring up. Do we have a couple more minutes? I apologize, but I've been bombarded in a few minutes with calls, so I need to bring up the program.
If I can share my screen, I will have it on my screen. Okay, just a sec. Let me just do it. This.
Okay, final program. Here we are.
You can see the session, right?
Mm-hmm.
Just a sec.
The session now.
No, è giusto, esatto. Adesso.
Okay, here we are.
Posso fare una domanda?
Yes, please.
Allora, le presentazioni dobbiamo mandarle a voi anche per essere sicuri oppure le visualizziamo ciascuno presentare?
Potrete condividerle condividendo lo schermo, come sta facendo. Se mi dice il suo nome poi glielo aggiungo sotto, glielo rinomino perché lei compare come relatore. Se mi dice lei è la dottoressa?
Giacchina Ricca Elena.
Ah, ok, Elena. Susanna Di Martino, ci siamo conosciuti anni fa.
Infatti.
Ottimo, adesso rinominiamo. Quindi se vuoi, se per sicurezza mandamelo, altrimenti puoi anche condividere il tuo schermo.
Ok, grazie.
Devo chiedere se potreste mandare il link per seguire la conferenza, non quello per gli speaker, perché me lo chiede anche la coautrice del quarto paper. Magari dispiace rimandarlo.
Allora, posso rimandarlo senza problemi. Tenga conto che il link è sul programma, cioè se apre il programma
Va bene.
la sezione, apre direttamente il collegamento.
Ok, vai. D'accordo. Vediamo un po'. Allora. Ok, so abbiamo, qui tra di noi possiamo parlare italiano, credo. Abbiamo 15 minuti, scusate, un'ora e un quarto, quindi normalmente quanto date a ogni speaker?
Quanti sono i paper? Sono 4. 4, dividiamo un'ora e un quarto per 4. Totale.
Chiaro, si potrebbe fare un quarto d'ora a testa e un quarto d'ora per domande, però non so se un quarto d'ora per domande sia abbastanza.
Ok, in realtà, dottor Barbieri, è lei il chairman, quindi da lei i tempi. E do il benvenuto al professor Bonatti.
Grazie molto.
Abbiamo, cioè, chi si collega ha la possibilità di fare domande?
Allora, se al termine della sessione avanza del tempo, chi è collegato come partecipante, non speaker, chi è collegato come speaker ovviamente può alzare la mano, ma anche chi è collegato come partecipante può alzare la mano e noi lo possiamo abilitare a partecipante in modo che possa intervenire sia con audio che con video, oppure via chat. Quindi sarà lei a dire se vuole o meno fare la sessione di Q&A.
Okay. Thank you very much to Susanna Di Martino. And let me thank Riccardo Barbieri Ermita, that is the chairman of this session. Riccardo, good morning. Are you hearing me?
Yes, I can hear. Yes.
Are you hearing me? Okay. I thank Riccardo Barbieri for his chairing this session. Riccardo Barbieri is the chief economist and head of the Department of Economic Analysis of the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and he has a lot of activity on the the problem of model of Italian economy. That is one important part of his activity at the minister, but it's not only his activities representing at OECD and the other international meetings, the Ministry of Economy and Finance. And I thank you very much, Riccardo, for being here with us. And let me say that we are interested in discussing the public and fiscal policy and the European recovery, Italy in the European recovery, and starting from the presentation of Riccardo Barbieri. Take the floor, Riccardo.
Thank you, Luigi, and hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. Today we are focusing the session on fiscal policy and public policies in response to some of the challenges from the pandemic crisis, and also in view of environmental issues. The four papers, I think, are all quite interesting. The first one deals with the new economic model, macroeconomic model called ITFIN, developed at the Treasury here in Rome, with the goal of modeling the flows, the financial flows in the economy, and being able to treat the interaction between the financial sector and the real economy in a more structured way, and also to model things like the spread on government bonds in an endogenous way. Also simulating effects of monetary and fiscal policies, also in conjunction in certain phases. Carlo Favero, who has played a leading role in developing the model, is a well-known academic, as you all know, from Bocconi University, will be presenting some simulations on the ITFIN model. The second paper is a counterfactual analysis of the policies that were followed by the Italian government during the COVID-19 crisis, particularly in 2020. And it's a very interesting contribution. As you may imagine, the moment we understood the likely effects of the COVID crisis, and I'm talking about the very final days of February of last year, early March, we had to rush to develop a number of analytical tools. I think this paper is a byproduct of those efforts, and has been developed by Giovanni Di Bartolomeo from University of Rome. Can you hear me? Paolo D'Imperio and Francesco Felici here at the Treasury. The third paper, I think, is also quite significant. I think there is a mic on. If you can all mute, please. I was saying the third paper summarizes work that's currently taking place at the Treasury on how to assess different fiscal rules at the European level. That's also a very important topic for policy making, especially looking at the hopefully forthcoming economic recovery after the COVID crisis. How hard are the different fiscal rules? How should we rank them? How should we view them? Obviously, it's a very complex issue, but it is important also to define the position of the Italian government, given that at the European level, there is an agreement that the fiscal rules will be revisited. And the expectation is that this debate will become a lot more concrete after the parliamentary elections in Germany. with a view to try and agreeing on any changes that will be decided by next year, because it has been decided at the European level that Stability Pact will continue to be suspended in 2022, but unless there are further downside surprises in this long crisis, then in 2023 we'll go back to applying the fiscal rules. So it is a topic on which we will surely return, and I anticipate there will be further contributions, but I think it's quite an interesting topic. The paper will be presented by Davide Salve and Elena Giachin-Ricca, who are two of the co-authors. And finally, Professor Bonatti from the University of Trento will be presenting a paper on public policy and long-run growth in a model with environmental degradation. I think a very interesting question that takes us perhaps to a longer-term issue, but that is also very important to define what will be our positions in the ongoing discussions at the European level. And obviously it's also very topical given the efforts that have been put into finalizing the Recovery and Resilience Plan, and given the ongoing efforts that the government is making to update the Energy and Climate Plan and the Emission Reduction Plan for 2050. So I will not take any more time. I think we have around 15 minutes per paper. So I would ask the authors to please speak for no longer than 15 minutes. I will remind them 1 or 2 minutes before the end of their slot. And hopefully we will have time for a bit of a debate at the end, hoping to close around 1 o'clock. I guess Luigi will remind us, Professor Paganetto will remind us of the timing of the end of this session. So let's give the floor to Carlo Favero, thanking him for being with us on the ITFIN model.
Thank you very much, Riccardo. It's a great pleasure to be here for many reasons, and probably the main one is that this session is entitled to Riccardo Faini. Riccardo Faini was the person that I met when I was a student and convinced me to be an economist. I have a fond memory of him as a great economist and a gentleman. So we move now to our model, and I will use these 15 minutes to present, to give you an overview of the model, and if there is a time to show you some simulation. But before I show the simulation, I want you to be in the position of understanding what's the engine that is generating this simulation. This is a joint effort of the ITFIN modeling team that lists a number of persons that are in the program. So, modeling approach. The model has two distinctive features. The first one is the strong focus on the financial and the banking system. And the second is a clear emphasis on the macroeconomic consequences of sovereign risk, which is on which the model focuses as one of the main drivers of the Italian economy. And there are many reasons why this is the case. So to develop this feature, the evolution over time of financial asset and liability of different sectors is carefully modeled. And it originates from financial flows, which are associated to agents' decision on saving and portfolio composition, so how they allocate their wealth among many assets. Importantly, the modeling strategy imposes consistency between stock and flows in each sector of the economy. So for each sector, there is always one residual asset or liabilities which is not modeled, but rather derived from the stock flow consistency. So the model has the following institutional sectors that reflects the national financial accounts. So we have households, government, non-financial firms, banks, insurance companies, pension and mutual funds, and then there is the rest of the world and the central bank. Now, central bank in Europe must be declined carefully because there is the national central bank, of which we are looking at the evolution of asset liabilities, and there is the European Central Bank. So in our modeling approach, the national central bank implements unconventional monetary policy on behalf of the ECB by executing sovereign debt purchases on the secondary market, as well as the LTRO and TLTRO operation. It also, of course, operates through the standard banks refinancing channel. The European Central Bank instead implements conventional monetary policy by setting the monetary policy rates. We do not follow the asset and liabilities of the European Central Bank, while we do follow within the model the asset and liabilities evolution of the Bank of Italy. So the model employs a large but simplified number of different asset types. The idea of our simplification is that we leave out those assets that are not empirically relevant. And we try to reproduce a realistic portfolio allocation of the agents and assign, of course, a relevant role to money, credit, and finance in shaping the pattern of variables in the economy. Importantly, what is crucial to the model is to keep track of the interconnectedness of the sector. So think, for example, of this famous diabolic loop, which happens when banks hold government debt. You have a shock to the price of government debt. Of course, this will affect bank lending and eventually the evolution of the economy. The model is designed to keep track of the interconnectedness among sectors that is a consequence of the portfolio allocation of different sectors. Importantly, the model also tracks the effect of simplification and omission. In fact, the size of the discrepancies between the net financial position of each sector in the model, i.e. with simplification, and in the data, i.e. without our simplification and modeling assumption, is an indicator of the effect of omitted variables. And this is now, I'm just give you an overview of the balance sheet of the economy and how we simplify. Just to give you an example here, you have our 7 sectors, and here you have the non-financial and financial assets that they hold. Of course, asset for one sector is a liability for another one. If you look at the government, you see our simplification. The government in our world has only liabilities, and liabilities are distinguished in short-term bills and long-term liabilities, i.e. government bonds. There are no loans in the model, while of course in reality there are some loans. In keeping track of the evolution of the debt, we see what is the relevance of our modeling simplification assumption. So that's the balance sheet. Now we move up the flow of funds. That's the flow of funds. Of course, you distinguish. We keep track of non-financial transaction for our 7 sectors, and of financial transaction. These are the non-financial transaction, and these are the financial transaction. And of course, stock flow consistency is imposed because the amount, the net assets of each sectors are tracked over time as the sum of the net assets in the previous period and then the net lending of the sectors. This allows to track imbalances in the economy. What are the focal points in the model? I think the main focal point is the interplay between financial and real variables. The second point is when we look at the market for government debt, we have the possibility of each asset, the market for each asset is modeled by looking at the equilibrium between demand and supply. In the case of government debt, it's obvious that there are non-linearities in the demand for government debt, and such non-linearities give rise to the possibility of multiple equilibria. Well, if you want to simplify, you can have a good and a bad equilibrium, and so you can rationalize jump in the price of government bonds, and of course in yield to maturities, by the fact that under some condition, the economy might move swiftly from one equilibrium to the other one. Of course, we have the stock flow consistency. Among nominal variable, inflation is anchored to the ECB target in the model. And the model is geared to simulate the effect of monetary and fiscal policy. Monetary policy is divided into unconventional and conventional. Fiscal policy is modeled with two possible scenarios. One is a scenario in which the primary surplus is modeled via a fiscal reaction function. This scenario can be overridden in the model, and you can have an exogenous exogenous path for all the fiscal policy variables. Now, a little bit of graphic intuition behind the focal points in the model. The first intuition is the following: the model does not have a Phillips curve type of relationship between unemployment and inflation. Rather, unemployment is modeled a la Farmer, with the possibility of a multiple equilibrium that are pinned down by shocks to financial variable. And you see some motivating graph for this modeling option that are provided by looking at the relationship between the unemployment rate and the stock market index and the spread between Italian 10-year bonds and German bonds over time. Of course, the model is estimated looking only at the Euro period using quarterly data. Second motivating graph, which brings you a visual idea of the importance of nonlinearity. Here I look at this is just a cross plot of the relationship between the spread and the quantity of Italian long-term bonds demanded by the rest of the world, households, financial companies, insurance companies, and pension funds. You can see that while in the case of Italian households, there is very little elasticity of demand to the spread, in the case of the rest of the world, you have what I was suggesting before, you have a backward kink relationship, which points out at the possibility of having multiple equilibria, because if you think of the potential crossing between this demand curve and a supply curve, even if the supply curve is regularly sloped, you might have two crossing points, and then you have a good equilibrium at low level of the spread and a bad equilibrium at a high level of the spread. And the model feature this possibility. Now, to illustrate our modeling strategy, what I will do for you, I single out, Riccardo, can I ask you to give me a warning when there are 5 minutes to go?
Sure, I think we are getting there.
Okay, okay. I want to give you an idea of how we our modeling approach by singling out the government sector, and then I will show you a couple of simulations. So government holds no financial asset, and as I said, two type of liabilities, bills and bond. And we have, we model both the behavior of the fiscal authority and of the public debt manager. What does the public debt manager do? In each period, the public debt manager plans to finance the entire public deficit by issuing bonds, but it does so by based on his expectation for prices. Then there can be expectation error on the prices of long-term debt, and then treasury bills are used as a buffer to cover the discrepancies between planned and actual borrowing requirement. And here you can see the stock flow consistency, right? In the sense that the bonds, the market for bonds is modeled carefully, looking at demand supply. Bills, there is no explicit equation, but bills are modeled through the stock flow consistency principle. And of course, equilibrium bond price is determined by equating the supply of bonds and the nominal demand of them, which is linked to saving and portfolio decision of lenders. And the demand is non-linear to take into account the feature of the data that I illustrated before. Then there are two options. You simulate the model under a fiscal reaction function, or you under an exogenous path for the fiscal variable. Here is an illustration of simplification. This is the government actual stylized financial balance sheet, in which you have asset, liability, bonds and bills. In our model, we have only government bond and bills, so there will be some residuals that you can use to evaluate what's the cost of the modeling assumption you have made in simplification. And this is the government budget constraint. And of course, you can see that there are only bonds and bills, and then there is the usual intertemporal accounting model for an intertemporal budget constraint for the fiscal authority, and we have here the stock flow adjustment that comes about because of price changes in the asset for the agent liability for the government. And that's what the debt manager initially plans: issue bonds to cover the entire needs given a price expectation, but then price expectations are formed using these adaptive schemes. Then an equilibrium price is realized. The equilibrium price could be different from the expected price, and then bills are issued to cover the gap. And that you can see it's an identity, not an estimated equation. And these are the features of the demand, and the nonlinearity are modeled. So demand is a nonlinear function of the spread, and the nonlinearities are modeled using the Hermite polynomial that are used in the term structure model of in the model of the term structure of interest rates. And of course, finally, the supply of the debt is determined by the stock of existing debt and by the government deficit. And of course, the deficit is driven by the primary deficit, interest payment. Interest payment, it's function of the duration of the debt, and the term structure of interest rate. The primary surplus, as I said, is determined either by a fiscal reaction function or using an exogenous path. Okay, so that is and with this type of structure, each sector is modeled, and then all sectors are brought together. So model simulation, and I'm just spending the last 2 minutes to illustrate quickly a model simulation. And this model simulation is focused on monetary policy, and in the model, the demand for sovereign bonds by the central banks is exogenous. And so we consider two counterfactual scenarios. The baseline scenario is the scenario that we have in which the pandemic emergency purchase program goes on. And in the two counterfactual scenario, we have the first one where net purchases of government bond are those envisaged before the outbreak of COVID. And so we look at a situation in which the PEP program were not launched. In the second one, we have a more dramatic case of undoing of the unconventional monetary expansion with a pattern of net asset sales by the central bank of government bonds starting from 2021. So these are the three exogenous scenarios. So this is the baseline scenario. This is counterfactual number one, which is more restrictive, and counterfactual number two, which is a strong exit strategy. Now, I think I have just the time to show you the effect on spread. So what we report here are deviation from the baseline, and in case of in the baseline model, the spreads hover around 90-100 basis points. The debt to GDP ratio gets stabilized, and the deficit on GDP ratio fluctuates around 3-4% of GDP for the simulation period. Here you can see the importance of so you can see the effect of the two different monetary policy on the spread, and you can see the effect of nonlinearities. In particular, you can see that the dramatic exit will ignite a movement from the good equilibrium to the bad equilibrium, and the spread gets 300 basis points higher than the baseline scenario by 29, while in the less aggressive scenario, you have that the spread it's 100 basis points higher than in the baseline, and all the effect on the economy follows from this, and we track the effect of the spread first on the bank lending and then on economic activity. I think I shall stop here to respect the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlo. So I think we can immediately move on to the second paper, the one on the counterfactual analysis of the policies taken during the COVID crisis. Thank you, Carlo. I think your presentation highlighted how the model allows us to simulate monitoring fiscal policies. So it can answer very interesting questions, and we could also simulate different fiscal rules as the driver of the issuance policy of the government. So simulate what would happen under alternative scenarios from that point of view, and that links into actually the third paper that's being presented today. But let's then go to the counterfactual analysis. I think it's Paolo D'Imperio who is presenting, if I understood correctly.
Yes.
So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you see the presentation, right?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Okay, first of all, I would like to thank Paganetto, the committee, and conference for hosting.
Your audio comes and goes. Can you please speak closer to the mic?
Yes. So I was just thanking the organizers of the conference, and this is a joint work with Giovanni Di Bartolomeo and Francesco Felici, and this is a paper on the fiscal response to the COVID-19 crisis. And we will see in a moment why we decided to use a counterfactual analysis to tackle this topic. And the reason why we decided to write this paper is basically because the The COVID-19 transmission channels and the impact of fiscal measures are still a relatively unexplored field. And of course, we focus on the Italian case, which of course is we believe it is an important case. So what we do in this paper, we analyze the transmission channels of the pandemic to the real economy, and we also try to provide a quantitative assessment of the fiscal measures approved in 2020 by the Italian government. So we only focus on fiscal measures approved in 2020, not on the ones which have been approved during this year. And we do this through a model-based counterfactual scenario. Just let me tell you that this paper is mainly based on a study which was recently published by the European Commission, which I'm supporting here on these slides. So let's move to the model we use. The model we use is the Quest3 R&D model. It is a model developed by the European Commission. It is a DSG model, a micro-funded DSG model. There are 2 countries in this model, Italy, the rest of the euro area, and the rest of the world. Just to give you a sense of the complexity of the model we are using, this is a model with almost 500 endogenous variables and, of course, questions, while the parameters of the model are calibrated or estimated through Bayesian techniques by the European Commission. Just a sketch of the model, the economy is populated by heterogeneous households. The production side is quite standard in a new Keynesian fashion. We have monopolistic competition and firms face sticky prices. We also have in the model a semi-endogenous technological change. So there is an R&D sector, while monetary authority and the fiscal authority follow standard routes. So the approach of this paper is the following. We basically start from the steady state, or from the baseline, let's say. The baseline for us is the pre-pandemic world. So in a way, so it is basically 2019. On this baseline scenario, we introduce the pandemic shock. We will see in a moment how we introduce the pandemic shock into the model. We also introduce the policy action. So the fiscal policies approved in 2020, and this allows us to build a policy scenario. The policy scenario is basically what we observed in 2020. Now, if we switch off the fiscal policies, what we obtain is the counterfactual scenario. And the difference between the policy scenario and the counterfactual scenario gives us a measure of the impact of the fiscal measures approved and implemented in 2020. So this is the approach. Now, how we introduce the pandemic shock into the model? Well, we basically assume that the pandemic shock is a combination of different kinds of exogenous shocks. We believe that the pandemic shock, and this is in line with the paper I was previously mentioning, of course, hits the economy as a supply shock. And the supply shock, in a way, captures the impact of the pandemic on firms, on the reduction of production, so on the supply side. And we calibrate the supply shock proportionally to the lockdown measures that were implemented during 2020. At the same time, we also believe that the pandemic shock hits the economy through a demand shock. A demand shock basically captures the impact of the pandemic on consumption. So the demand shock is calibrated in order to align the model to the consumption dynamic observed for Italy in 2020. A third shock is an uncertainty shock. An uncertainty shock, basically the idea is that because of the pandemic, because of the uncertainty, firms tend to cut on investments. So this uncertainty shock is primarily calibrated in order to capture the observed reduction in investment that we observed during 2020. And then there is a fourth channel. This is, we can call this a liquidity crisis channel in a way. This is in a way an amplifier of all the other shocks we are introducing into the model. And the idea is that, of course, because of the pandemic, a fraction of firms might become liquidity constrained. So a fraction of firms, we assume that a fraction of firms do not have access to the credit market. And when this is the case, investment become very pro-cyclical. Of course, investment tends to be pro-cyclical, but when this channel is in place, investments are strongly pro-cyclical. And in order to introduce this channel, we modified the Quest model, introducing this channel, which formally is introduced into the model, assuming that investments are just a function of internal financing for firms, at least for the fraction of firms that is liquidity constrained. Now, as I just said, the first point was to introduce the pandemic shock to build the policy scenario. Then we have to introduce the policy interventions. The policy interventions are basically the combined impact of the main law decrees approved in 2020, and they basically for a total of almost 175 billion of additional net borrowing over the period 2020-2022. Here in this table, I'm just reporting the different fiscal measures divided in three broad categories. So income and labor support measures, business support measures, which also include the liquidity measures. And of course here, this is just the on-budget component of the liquidity measures. And other public expenditures, here policy expressed in a percentage of 2019 GDP. And of course, I don't need to say that this was a huge fiscal stimulus. Now, let's move to the main results of this paper. What I'm showing you here is the policy scenario. This is the dynamic of the Italian GDP in quarterly deviation from, so you can see this as a deviation from the last quarter of 2019, and these are quarterly deviations. So the model, as I just said, is aligned by construction to what we observed for 2020. So for the first 4 quarters, the model is perfectly aligned thanks to the pandemic shock that we introduced, thanks to the fiscal policy shock we introduced, to what we observed. Then, for the rest of the period, this is just the model-based convergence to the steady state. So it should not be seen as a forecast, but just as the model-based converging toward the steady state. And the model, again, is just aligned to 2020 figures, so it's not aligned to what happened in the first quarters of 2021. And of course, there was a huge drop in GDP that we observed. GDP went down by almost 18% in the second quarter of 2020. But if we move to the counterfactual scenario, of course, we see that GDP would have fallen much more without the fiscal policy measures. So the differential between the policy scenario and the counterfactual scenario are basically the impact of the fiscal measures. And now here the assumption is that in the policy scenario, there are no firms which are liquidity constrained, basically thanks to the public guarantee schemes and other liquidity support measures of the government. So the liquidity channel is closed in the policy scenario, while we open the liquidity channel in the counterfactual scenario to obtain these two scenarios and to measure the impact of the different policy measures. So I guess it's interesting also to look at the same graph, but also for other macroeconomic variables. Again, here the blue lines are the policy scenarios, which are aligned to observed data, while the red dotted lines are the counterfactual scenario. And you can see that, for instance, for investment, observed investment went down a lot during 2020, but in the counterfactual scenario, the fall in investment would have been much worse. Now, the next table basically summarizes all the results, all the main results of this paper. Now we are looking at annual deviation from the baseline. So you should probably recognize these figures. And let's just look at GDP. GDP in 2020 went down, fell by 8.9%. But in a counterfactual scenario, in our estimated counterfactual scenario, GDP would have fallen by 13.4%, with a difference of 4.4 percentage points. And as you can see in the last part of the table, which reports the differential between the policy scenario and the counterfactual scenario. The difference between these two scenarios is quite significant also for 2021 and 2022, according to our estimates, of course. Then we can have a look at investments. Investment fell by 9.2%. Observed investment fell by 9.2% in 2020. According to our estimates, investment would have fallen by almost 22% without the fiscal policy measures, with a significant difference, of course, between the two scenarios. So these are our main results here. I'm just focusing on GDP and investment because of time constraint. Now, what I would like to show you is basically the contribution of the different policy measures to the differential between the policy scenario and the counterfactual scenario. So these graphs we are looking at are the positive contribution from the different fiscal policy measures, which here are categorized in three broad categories. So in yellow, we have business support measures. In blue, we have income and labor support measures, and other measures mainly related to public consumptions and investment. And as you can see, GDP, the positive impact was mainly driven by the business support.
Paolo, can you wrap it up within the next minute or two?
Yes. And
thank you.
Yes. And consumption was mainly driven by income and labor support measures, as expected, while the impact on investment mainly stemmed from business support measures. Employment is driven by a combination of the three categories. Here I just have a shock decomposition just to show you what are the drivers behind the counterfactual scenario. Here we have demand uncertainty in the supply shock, and as you can see from the dynamic of GDP, the main driver in the counterfactual scenario were demand side shocks. Now, just for illustrative purposes, I would like to show you again the policy scenario and the counterfactual scenario over a longer horizon. And here I would also like to add the impact stemming from the National Recovery and Resilience Plan. These are just the official estimates reported in the plan. And as you can see, if we put together the impact from the fiscal measures to tackle the COVID-19 crisis and the NGO impact, what we are looking at, of course, is an unprecedented fiscal stimulus, which will hopefully set the economy on a path of sustained growth. And just to conclude, so according to our estimates, fiscal measures, without fiscal measures, GDP would have fallen by 13.4% in 2020 against the 8.9% observed. The cumulative impact of public measures on GDP, we are talking about COVID-related measures, is close to 11 percentage points. And of course, there is a huge impact on investment through public guarantee schemes and in general through liquidity support measures. Just would like to conclude, say that of course, given the exceptional nature of the crisis, results must be viewed with due caution, paying particular attention to the assumptions underlying the simulations. And I would also like to say that of course we are aware of the complementarity between fiscal and monetary policies, but we leave this for future studies. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. I think one question that stems from your presentation is that you talked about, in describing how you modeled the drop in private consumption and investment, you said you calibrated the model in order to obtain the observed drop in private consumption. Now, the observed drop in private consumption and investment reflects also the 105.3 billion of support measures enacted by the parliament, obviously, following law decrees. And so now how do you correct for the fact that your counterfactual might, in a way, include the policy actions themselves?
Well, I was probably not precise on this. The policy scenario includes not only the pandemic shock, but also the fiscal policy.
Right.
So when we're looking at the policy scenario, we are looking at a combination, the pandemic shocks and the fiscal measures. Then when we move from the policy scenario to the counterfactual scenario, we simply switch off the measures and activate.
But you keep the behaviors. So the behavioral parameters, what I'm saying is simply that
okay, yes.
the behavioral parameters of consumption and investment might be affected by the measures themselves, but you're then using them to estimate the counterfactual. That's perhaps one objection.
Yes, we estimate the exogenous shocks to align the model to observed variables. We do not touch the deep parameters of the model.
Yeah, obviously, but the parameters themselves are affected by the policies that were implemented.
Of course.
So I think that perhaps, and I think now we don't have time to go into this question in depth, but it's also quite interesting to ask, at least it's interesting to find out if you were able to model the guarantees or the measures that were implemented. You essentially switch them off, but can the model capture the fact that you are switching off the loan guarantees, the moratorium, the wage supplementation fund, and so on? Can you capture all these policies that are being switched off in your counterfactual scenario?
Well, yes, in the sense that in this model, rational agents take this into consideration. So when we switch off the model, behavioral equations of our models basically allows rational agents to deal with this. So in a way, this is partially modeled, but of course we could try to extend and work.
Perfect. Okay, well, maybe we should leave it there. Thanks a lot, because we have already used more than half our time. So let's move on to the third paper. Thank you very much, Paolo. It's a very interesting contribution. And so we move to Davide and Elena to tell us about the fiscal rules. Please.
Thank you, Riccardo. I hope you can hear loud and clear. And that you can see the screen.
I personally cannot hear you very well. Try again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay.
Fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. I will first give you an insight of what this is about, and then present the first part before giving the floor to Elena. Well, basically, this work is motivated by the ongoing revision of the EU fiscal framework. I will not spend too much time on the process. I'm trying to be in general as brief as I can. I will just point out that the current framework is a result of subsequent and developing reforms. The main change probably happened with the introduction of the sixth pack, which introduced a distinction between the preventive and the corrective arm of the stability and growth part. The Commission actually launched and then suspended the revision process because of the COVID pandemic that could be reactivated later. As I broadly speaking, the work is intended to shed some light on a few key issues that should be explored more in depth before we embark on the revision of the fiscal rules. Main issue, fiscal performance in Italy and its interaction with the EU fiscal rules. And we do that by asking ourselves two questions: what happened in the past and what will happen in the future? We try to answer those questions by looking at past performance and then simulating the dynamics of fiscal variables on the basis of the current framework, and then comparing it with what the implications could be from the EFP proposal for reform. Why is that? That's because the EFP proposal is currently the one that is detailed enough to be simulated and more simulations in the future. So for the past, we look at cyclicality of fiscal policy to compliance with the FTP, and then we, for the simulation, we simply assume compliance starting in 2023, and then perform sensitivity analysis and simulations. On performance of fiscal policy, what we can certainly say is that fiscal policies have been predominantly pro-cyclical in Italy, and this is consistent with studies in other countries. And based on Italian experience, if we define fiscal effort as the change in structural balance between 1999 and 2019, we found 12 episodes of pro-cyclical variation against 9 episodes, green dots, on counter-cyclical variation. In this period, the cumulative pro-cyclical change, as we can see from the right-hand side of the graph, is almost twice as large as the cumulative counter-cyclical change, suggesting a strong prevalence of pro-cyclical effects. And if we limit ourselves to the pro-cyclicality, in Italy, the cumulative deterioration, as you can see, is as important as the cumulative adjustment in bad times, signaling that there is pro-cyclicality is a problem both in good and in bad times. Looking at compliance, we look at compliance in two ways: numerical compliance and legal or formal compliance. Numerical compliance, we use the EFB compliance tracker, but we have to warn against a few issues. And keep in mind that this requires defining a simplified rules. A simplified rule has to be applied backward, assuming implicitly that rules are static all the time. That implies that there are problems in comparing periods, but also it's important to do that numerically because it gives you an insight of what happens in the long run. And so when we do that, well, for legal compliance, we simply revise the condition assessments. So looking at compliance, what we can see from the EFB compliance tracker is that Italian compliance with the rules on average has been very, very bad, meaning that on average, not only Italian compliance with the rule has been lower than the average, but the lowest across all member states, with the exception of France. And we can also see that if we break down the average compliance by indicators, by single indicators, we can see that strongly depends on debt, on repeated failure to comply with the debt rule. And in fact, the deficit compliance is not so distant from the EU average, while debt rule compliance is over 5%, which means only 1. If we go on and try to ask what happens after the introduction of the six-pack, so basically from 2012 to 2009, numerically speaking, compliance improves. Compliance improves and improves both in relative and in absolute terms. We can see that it improves on average for the euro area and the European Union, and for Italy, compliance tracking goes up to 43.8%. But especially in structural terms. So if we focus on compliance based on structural balance and the expenditure benchmark taken together, we can see that compliance for the euro area improves by roughly 1/3, while for Italy it more than doubles. And we attribute this to the fact that after the six-pack, the structural variables began even finding for Italy indicated probably we have some more attention for fiscal policy. I will not spend too much time on the size of the deviation, just saying that the deviation has to be overall limited except for the debt. The deviation, the size of the deviation for the debt rule has been huge, so you can find that is overall problem. It has been a problem for instance. If we look at compliance in legal terms or procedural terms, we focus our attention to the implementation of the preventive arm, which goes from 2014 to 2019. And we revised this table, the series, what happened during this time. Specifically, we can compare column 2 to column 6 and see that what we can immediately notice is that ex ante, we have a systematic signal flag of risk of significant deviation. So the assessment is always negative, while ex post, the assessment is always either positive or without any procedural consequence. And what happens is we resume the column 3, and it's a mix of better than expected fiscal developments, corrective measures of public finance, but also the application of flexibility clauses, the relevant factors, and the which is market of expression. And when we try to assess this, we draw some lessons from this. One is the flexibility clauses were only determined to ensure compliance in 2016, while in 2017 they came together with a correction measure. We can also say that in 2018, which was an election year, non-compliant judgment of non-compliance of course was overcome by correction measure that arrived in July 2019, and the other very important lesson that we can draw from this is the importance of the relevant factors. We find that the Commission issued 7 reports on that in 6 years, and the relevant factors were always a sufficient motivation to formally inspect that criteria. In particular, the compliance with the identified was the only factor still valid in 2018 and still sufficient to ensure compliance with that criteria, even if numerically it was not met. So I will stop here and give the floor to the additional presentation.
Okay. I would ask if you could finish at most in 5 minutes, because we're already running late.
Just one moment. It's not exactly. Can you see? No, I don't think so. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
No. Okay. I can see something now. Yeah.
Let's try this.
You should just enlarge the image, please.
It's not exactly.
Okay. But 5 minutes at most, please.
Yeah, we try. Okay, so it's a rather complex work. So after this historical background, let's try to see. We tried to see how the future could look like, and especially we developed a simulation tool which allows us to gain a better understanding of the implication of the possible future rules. The current framework and eventually proposals that are on the table and under discussion at the moment. This tool has a value added because it has a forward-looking approach and allows us to compare the performance of different EU member states. Although in this presentation, I will focus only, and we will focus only on the Italian results. So we assess the implication of the current SDP framework and of the European Fiscal Board proposal, which is an expenditure rule which aims on the debt to GDP target of 60% in 15 years. We have 2 sets of simulation. The first one starts from 2023, and just right after the general escape clause will be deactivated, and the other one is more of a laboratory environment where we start projecting from 2026 and doing some sensitivity analysis. What are the desirable features of fiscal rules we want to look at? The fiscal implication of fully complying with the rule should turn out to be counter-cyclical, making public debt sustainable, being credible in terms of size of annual fiscal adjustment required, and be predictable. Now, well, for our empirical analysis, we used the European Commission official forecast, both for the short, the medium, and the long term. Most of you will know that in the Commission released a short-term forecast for 2+2. Then we linked to the work and the methodology done by the Output Gap Working Group. And for the long term, we used the work done by the Aging Working Group. Important to say is that we have a cyclical correction specific to each rules, because each rule implies a specific fiscal adjustment, and this has a specific feedback on the economy. Okay, as I said, we assess the three basic rules of the SGP, the Stability and Growth Pact framework, and the DFD proposal. Here, just a brief evolution of over the medium term, starting from 2023, of structural primary balance, which is corrected by the output gap specific to each rule, and the debt trajectory. What we can see from here is that the MTO convergence rule actually calls for a smooth adjustment, while the debt rule is the most demanding in the short term. What turns out the EFB rule, the EFB proposal, is actually well behaving, let's say, and reasonable in the short term, but in the medium term, in order to achieve the debt reduction that implies the rule, implied by the rule, it needs a very high primary balance surplus. Counter-cyclicality. This graph shows in the 15-year how the fiscal stance will be, and we can confirm that basically the output gap being almost always negative because of the adjustments and the feedback on the economic growth and economic level, actual GDP. We have always a restrictive stance. Okay, the second set of our simulation is a sensitivity analysis. It's a sensitivity analysis. You can see me, right? We shocked several parameters, and we try to see what happens as a deviation from the baseline, where the baseline has nominal fiscal requirement, and what if these shocks are applied. Basically, in case of economic recession, the MTO convergence rule will be milder, and in case of, while the other, it's important to say, is that the expenditure rule wouldn't react so much to the cycle. In case of higher structural growth and higher primary balance, this would imply better fiscal performance in terms of higher revenues. Therefore, the fiscal requirements of both rules will be lower. In a scenario where the interest rates on debt could increase, we have, of course, higher fiscal efforts. Okay, so basically, fiscal rules at work in a lab environment shows that MTO is a response to the cyclical condition because it's designed to do that, while the expenditure rules, not so much. The summary, okay, of our empirical analysis. The MTO rule is less restrictive overall in terms of required annual fiscal adjustment. However, historically, we saw that the SGP rules ask for procyclicality, fiscal policy, both in bad times and good times. And this is confirmed also in our forward-looking approach analysis. Important to say is that the debt rule is not that much credible in terms of the fiscal requirement, and the EFB proposal could be considered very effective in terms of capital reduction, putting debt in a constant downward path, but it's very, very demanding in the medium term. Okay, so overall, what we can see is that the pandemic has proven that there is a strong need for a revision of fiscal rules. The simulation tool that we developed at the Treasury Department we believe as a valuable, it's valuable in offering future further insight on the reform proposal under discussion, although these assessment measures and calculate only the fiscal effort and the size of that. And this is not the only criteria on which to evaluate the fiscal rules. So the broader discussion will involve other criteria, other components of improving the current fiscal governance and coordination within the European within the European partner and the Euro area. Okay, thanks for everybody. Thanks to everybody to be on time.
Thank you, Davide and Elena. Obviously, these are that in various passages the authors said that Italy is not being compliant and so on and so forth. It's obvious that this is not an official position. It's a contribution from the authors. I would now like to move to Professor Bonatti for his presentation, and hopefully then at the end we'll have perhaps 5 minutes for any questions from the participants. Professor Bonatti, the floor is yours. You are muted.
Assemble a conference like this. And also my own sweet and nice memory of Riccardo Faini, really a very nice person beside a great economist. By the way, could you see my slides?
No.
No?
We are looking for a Zoom screen. Yeah. It's necessary to exit from this page.
No, it just needs to share the screen, but select then the application where he has the presentation.
Can you hear me?
No, we can hear you. You just need on your screen to click on condividere lo schermo, and then you don't need to log again into anything. Just within this application, Zoom webinar.
No, Professor Bonatti, non devi rientrare in Zoom. Chiudi questa schermata Zoom, chiudi proprio, non ti preoccupare, perché sei collegato già. Quindi devi solo...
No, mi sta riempendo le cose. No, non deve compilare.
Vedo, non ci senta.
Professore non deve compilare quel modulo, deve semplicemente shift da un'altra a un'altra applicazione. Non deve utilizzare il link.
No, ma non ci senta.
No. Se lei è su Zoom webinar, deve semplicemente andare col mouse in fondo alla pagina dove c'è scritto condividere schermo e cliccare su condividere schermo.
Adesso glielo dico, mi sono collegata al telefono con lui.
Can you hear me now?
Professor Bonatti, ci sente?
Noi la sentiamo, professor Bonatti. Lei ci sente? Ok.
So, sorry, I apologize for having lost these precious minutes. Could you see my slides?
Vediamo una pagina Zoom che deve chiudere e sotto vediamo una slide, quindi deve chiudere questa pagina di collegamento. La chiuda con la X o la renda piccola con il meno in alto. Professor Bonatti?
Sì.
Con il meno in alto di questa pagina Google, deve uscire da Google perché lei è già collegato. Chiuda questa pagina con la X. La X in alto a destra di questa pagina Zoom Meeting.
Sì, no, ho capito. Ah.
Questa, ma anche le altre. Può chiudere tutto questo. Esatto, lì. Perfetto, chiuda anche questa.
Yeah.
Chiuda.
Yes, provo a chiudere ovviamente, però
Lo
per
vediamo.
qualche ragione
Lo
non si
vediamo.
chiude, cioè non voglio uscire del tutto dal webinar.
No, ma è dentro, è già dentro il webinar, non esce.
Ok.
È uscito. È di nuovo uscito.
Scusate, non avete la presentazione del professore in modo che la possiate gestire voi?
Adesso gliela chiediamo. Abbiamo la presentazione. Stiamo cercando la sua presentazione, professor.
Susanna, mi senti?
Sì, io ti sento.
Non abbiamo la presentazione del professor Bonatti. Me la faccio inviare.
Okay. So let me see if now I can share with you my screen. So perhaps if I may suggest to the chairman, you may go on with the general discussion because I'm wasting all your time and I'm sorry for this.
Okay.
So please go ahead with the discussion because I don't know, but
yeah,
these problems.
As I said, if you move your mouse to the bottom of the application screen, you can click.
This one of reserve requirement, although also politically difficult, I think it's a more politically feasible solution if.
Sorry. Okay, so perhaps while Professor Bonatti figures out the application, we can perhaps ask if there are any comments from other panelists on the three papers that have been presented so far.
I have a small question for Paolo. Paolo, in your paper, do you have the path of variable for the baseline simulation, so the one without shocks? You're muted though.
Yes, do you want me to show the policy scenario or?
So the problem is that you have deviation from the baseline, but I didn't see the baseline.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So what happens in the baseline in which you have no shocks?
And the baseline, the model is just on the steady state.
So it's zero.
Yes, it's zero now. It's on the steady state. It's zero. Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's what I suspected, but I found then the statement deviation from the baseline redundant. Okay, okay, yeah,
yes,
okay, fine.
Yes, thank you.
Professor Bonatti, mi sente?
Sì, la sento.
Le ho scritto in chat, potrebbe gentilmente inviarmi le slide in modo da poter andare avanti con l'intervento?
Sì, se ci riusciamo. Scusate ancora, mi dice per favore l'indirizzo a cui...
Sì, le ho scritto in chat.
Ah, ok. Vediamo se...
Okay, sorry, I'm wondering if Paolo was going to show something on the screen, or are we done with that?
Yes, we are.
Okay. Well, meanwhile, perhaps I'll go back to what I mentioned earlier and ask Carlo Favero about EatFin and the simulations with EatFin. Can we simulate different fiscal rules within the model and work out the path of the key macro variables and also study the interaction with the ECB policies?
Yes, of course. The model has a baseline fiscal rule. In this baseline fiscal rule, there are two motives that drive the primary surplus of deficit, which are the macro motive, the stabilization, and the debt stabilization motive. And these have the parameters that drive these responses have been estimated over the available sample. And as the model stands now, you can activate this rule or deactivate it. And then, of course, the interaction between fiscal and monetary policy comes endogenously because the central bank is behind a good chunk now of the demand for long-term Italian debt, right? And so the interaction between unconventional and monetary policy and fiscal policy is endogenized by the model.
May I ask one question?
Fiscal rules with the simulation, the macro simulations, the path of GDP. I think in most discussions about budget policy, about the fact that fiscal consolidation is often viewed as a form of fiscal austerity. It has a negative connotation and is thought to be a cause of poor economic performance. This model, although obviously within the limits of the assumptions that were made in building the model, would allow us and allows us to look at alternative fiscal rules and their effects on the macro variables for a given policy by the ECB. Of course, the policy of the ECB is exogenous in the model, but then we can study again, different approaches from the ECB depending on what kind of fiscal rule we are applying.
That's exactly right, Riccardo.
So I don't know if Paolo was ready. I think Elena had a comment to make.
Yeah, can I ask two things? First, I would like, probably I didn't catch, but how is the convergence to inflation in your model? And if you have some kind of fiscal reaction or use a multiplier for when you have this macroeconomic stabilization or the debt stabilization.
Is this a question about IFIN?
Yeah, both are in how IFIN works, and if you have considered these two features. For sure, the inflation target, how do you deal with the inflation target of 2%? And the other one is if you have some kind of
I can anticipate that, but Carlo, of course, will provide more details. But here, the ECB policy, obviously being at the euro area level, and IFIN is a model of the Italian economy, we are taking the ECB policy as exogenous. So it doesn't react to Italy's inflation rate, it reacts to the Eurozone inflation rate. But Carlo, please add if I said something incorrect or correct me.
That is correct. You can think of the standard conventional monetary policy as modeled by a Taylor rule for the euro area, substantially. While for the fiscal reaction function, we have only the Italian fiscal reaction function in the model.
Excellent. Paolo, were you going to say something about your model?
I don't know. Should I answer to any question?
No, I think there was an. I don't know if you were going to answer. You already answered in full.
To Professor Fabro, I guess so. Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
I think he did. Pretty much. It was just a clarifying question. It was very clear. So.
Okay. Fine. Okay. I think we are. I don't know. I think in the interest of time, maybe we could ask Professor Bonatti to say a few things about his paper, because we are running out of time.
He's trying to solve the problem. So if you can wait just a few minutes, please.
Professor Bonatti is connected now. And Federica also has the light because I sent her. So.
Yes, I got it.
Professor Bonatti, se provi a...
No.
Ok.
Ok. E Susanna, grazie tantissimo.
La sentiamo. Professor Bonatti, prego.
Okay. Unfortunately, I cannot see my slides, but let me at least introduce the paper, saying that this paper is trying to analyze the different environmental policies in an endogenous growth framework. So as Riccardo Barbieri said, this is mostly a long-term analysis. So we want, at the beginning, at least, we want to try to understand what are the properties of the balanced growth path, depending on the different policies. And then also, and this is the second stage of our analysis, to try to simulate the transitional path. Okay, now I can see also my slide. By the way, let me say that this is a joint paper with Lorenza Alessandra Lorenzetti of the Catholic University of Milan. Please go ahead with the slide. Yes. So we have a classical problem of market failure here, because we have two kinds of externalities: negative externalities, which are very much connected to the environmental problem. So production generates some emissions of pollutants that accumulate with negative effect on human well-being. And then, but then we have also some positive externalities that are attached to investment in productive assets in a very broad sense of the word: physical, human, intangible capital. And firms, by investing, they may raise also the overall productivity of the entire economy, thus allowing for unbounded growth. Please go ahead. Okay. But I said that that's a classical problem of market failure, but here the market failure can be quite dramatic because we have two hypotheses about the kind of damages that environmental deterioration can cause on human well-being. The first one is more benign, less dramatic, let's say, because there is no limit under the first hypothesis about the possibility for humans to defend themselves against environmental degradation by increasing the use of man-made artifacts. So people can, or societies can, mitigate the damage by increasing their defense expenditure, as they are called in the environmental literature. While in the second scenario, there is a threshold beyond which the adverse effects of the accumulation of pollutants, such as greenhouse gases, cannot be any longer mitigated. And this is exactly what, according to most scientists, is a possible effect of global warming over time. So let's go ahead, please, with the very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this. We have a private sector consisting of firms who are employing labor and who are investing in productive capital, but also they can investment in clean technologies, namely emission abatement capacity, green technologies. And then we have households, time allocation choice and income allocation choice between consumption and saving. Saving then will be allocated to firms, and firms will finance their investment with that. And then we have the government, a public agency, decides on three things: green taxes on emissions, subsidies to both private investment in productive capital and also private investment in green technologies. Let's go on, please. Thank you. So we have three stocks: the stock of pollutants, and then also the firm's abatement capacity, which is, as I said, the result of investment by firms. So the higher is this capacity, and all the other things remaining equal, the less pollutants are emitted by productive activities. And then we have the capital stock of the firms. The production function of the firms is quite a classical Cobb-Douglas, but where, as I said again, total factor productivity evolves as a result of all firms' investment in productive capital. Remember the positive externality. Of course, we have an economy resource constraint. Please, let's go ahead. And we compare our benchmark is the laissez-faire scenario. So we try to analyze the laissez-faire part of the economy. Laissez-faire here means no government intervention of any kind. And then we have the optimal path, assuming that there is a benevolent social planner. The next step of the analysis is to analyze to what extent the optimal path can be decentralized by using the policy instruments available to the government, those three that I described earlier, and then to see what happens when the government is constrained in the use of these instruments. For instance, because of too high initial public debt, because of course the government, the public agency has its own intertemporal budget constraint to satisfy. And as I said, we derive the balanced growth path, and then we obtain numerical solutions for the path converging to the balanced growth path by calibrating. That's something that is still a work in progress, by calibrating the model's parameters. Please go ahead. Can we move? Yes. So I don't want now to go over all prepositions that we derive on the balanced growth path. So let me simply say that in the under the hypothesis that the damage can be mitigated, always mitigated, under laissez-faire, the GDP growth can go on forever, in spite of the growing damage due to production, and environmental degradation in this case has never catastrophic effects. But of course, we have consequences in terms of welfare. That's a scenario in which long-term welfare is very much because people has to produce a lot, to work a lot, simply in order to mitigate the damages. You understand that this is not a very pleasant scenario in terms of human well-being in the long run. Please go ahead. But then we may analyze what's going on when we have this hypothetical benevolent planner with a full command of resource allocation. And we see that in general, we don't have growth, unbounded growth in the long run. It's better in this framework simply to go to in the long run to a steady state in which no further damage to the environment is caused by an increase of production, and so that people can work less. And so you may interpret this situation as a in a certain sense as a no growth is better than bad growth statement or slogan. And let's go on, please. We analyze more careful also some specific case, giving some value to our preferences. And in the very special case in which preferences are logarithmic, namely implying that the marginal utility of consumption is not affected by environmental degradation, in this case can be optimal also to have unbounded GDP growth. But again, that's a very peculiar case. And this is even more true if the technologies, technological progress in abatement, in clean and green technology is such that over time the production may cause less damage to the environment. And in this case, the optimal path becomes again consistent with unbounded growth. So you see that our conclusions are very much depending on parameters values. So it's very important to try to understand what are the technological characteristic of the technologies that will be implemented in the next future for trying to reduce and to reduce emissions. Please go ahead. So the conclusion that we can get, at least in the scenario in which it's always possible to offset the harm that environmental degradation cause, it's, as I said, relatively optimistic, at least. But I want to conclude talking about the other scenario. So please, let's move. I skipped this part on the decentralization of the optimal plan. As I said, it's possible with the three instruments that I described earlier to decentralize the optimal path. But again, this depends also very much on the constraint on the public debt existing at the beginning of time, the possibility of using fully this possibility of implementing the optimal plan by these taxes and subsidies. So let's go on, please. Thank you. So when under the hypothesis that we can have catastrophic consequences of the climate deterioration. At that point, we must be quite pessimistic, because under laissez-faire economic agents, since they don't have incentive to internalize the effects of their actions, so we can go quite straight to the catastrophe, let's call it. And this is a call for, of course, for policy interventions. And let's go on. So when, in general, when we have an optimal planner in this situation in which environmental degradation can be catastrophic, in general, the policy is such that we prefer avoiding unbounded growth in order to preserve the environment. Let's go on, please. This is the intuition that I was trying to convey to you about the climate apocalypse versus unbounded growth alternative. And let me conclude. Let's move on, please. Yes, yeah, okay. So, but also in this case, we can be very lucky if new technologies for reducing the impact on the environment will be very effective, that at that point, in this very peculiar case, we may think of also having
Leonardo, speravo che tu, sì, solo che speravo
to have an optimal,
mute the phone. Okay, thank you.
An optimal path with also with unbounded growth, and in this case, also in the long term, people well-being can be guaranteed by the fact that we may have together more consumption, and but with no no catastrophic impact on the environment. So sorry again for the problems that I had, and thank you for your patience.
Well, thank you very much. I think there will be a lot to discuss, but we are already 15 minutes past the agreed ending of this session. I asked Professor Paganetto if he has any comments or.
My comment is that has been very interesting, the debate also, and the presentation. So one of the sessions, in my judgment, that has been more rich of discussion and debate. This is very important, because frequently the web is a way by which the discussion is not particularly the outcome of the conference. So my compliment for that.
Thank you. I think the last paper raises a number of very interesting questions. I think the conclusion is that policies to contain environmental damage are preferable to laissez-faire. I guess when we try to translate that conclusion into the policies that the challenge we have ahead of us in the coming years. Question is, we are not simply investing in abatement, pollution abatement technologies, we are investing in changing the paradigm. As we change the paradigm, growth can actually come from the fact that we raise investment to be able to have a different economic model. So I think those who believe in green policies, just to use a simplified term, will probably also argue that we shouldn't see pollution abatement as something that limits GDP growth, but can actually generate economic growth along a different path. And the same probably holds for the consumption for land usage. You can preserve the environment and continue to build. You simply build vertically instead of horizontally, so to say. So I think perhaps the discussion in practical terms needs to be broadened to reflect the fact that all the things we are trying to do, for instance, with the recovery plan, hopefully will lead to, will revitalize economic growth rather than slow down economic growth.
Thank you to everybody.
Thanks a lot, Luigi, and thanks to the speakers. And see you at the next opportunity.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.